Chapter 19 of The Hunted Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joanne Rochon. The Hunted Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 19. Joanne's white lips spoke first. "The tunnel is closed," she whispered. Her voice was strange. It was not Joanne's voice. It was unreal, terrible, and her eyes were terrible as they looked steadily into his. Aldous could not answer. Something had thickened in his throat, and his blood ran cold as he stared into Joanne's dead white face and saw the understanding in her eyes. For a space he could not move. And then suddenly, as it had fallen upon him, the effect of the shock passed away. He smiled, and put out a hand to her. "A slide of rock has fallen over the mouth of the tunnel," he said, forcing himself to speak, as if it meant little or nothing. "Hold the lantern, Joanne, while I get busy." "A slide of rock?" she repeated after him dumbly. She took the lantern, her eyes still looking at him in that stricken way, and with his naked hands John Aldous set to work. 5 minutes, and he knew it was madness to continue. Hands alone could not clear the tunnel, and yet he worked, tearing into the rock and shale like an animal, rolling back small boulders, straining at larger ones until the tendons of his arms seemed ready to snap and his veins to burst. For a few minutes after that he went mad. His muscles cracked. He panted as he fought with the rock until his hands were torn and bleeding, and over again there ran through his head Blackton's last words: 4 o'clock this afternoon, 4 o'clock this afternoon. Then he came to what he knew he would reach very soon: a solid wall. Rock and shale and earth were packed as if by battering rams. For a few moments he fought to control himself before facing Joanne. Over him swept the grim realization that his last fight must be for her. He steadied himself and wiped the dust and grime from his face with his handkerchief. For the last time he swallowed hard. His soul rose within him almost joyously now, in the face of this last great fight, and he turned. John Aldous, the Superman. There was no trace of fear in his face as he went to her. He was even smiling in that ghostly glow of the lantern. "It is hard work, Joanne." She did not seem to hear what he had said. She was looking at his hands. She held the lantern nearer. "Your hands are bleeding, John." It was the first time she had spoken his name like that, and he was thrilled by the calmness of her voice, the untrembling gentleness of her hand as it touched his hand. From his bruised and bleeding flesh she raised her eyes to him, and they were no longer the dumb, horrified eyes he had gazed into 15 minutes before. In the wonder of it, he stood silent, and the moment was weighted with an appalling silence. It came to them both in that instant, the tick, tick, tick of the watch in his pocket. Without taking her eyes from his face, she asked, "What time is it, John?" "Joanne." "I'm not afraid," she whispered. "I was afraid this afternoon, but I'm not afraid now. What time is it, John?" "My God, they'll dig us out!" he cried wildly. "Joanne, you don't think they won't dig us out, do you? Why, that's impossible. The slide has covered the wires. They've got to dig us out. There is no danger, none at all. Only it's chilly and uncomfortable, and I'm afraid you'll take cold." "What time is it?" she repeated softly. For a moment he looked steadily at her, and his heart leaped when he saw that she must believe him, for though her face was as white as an ivory cross, she was smiling at him. Yes, She was smiling at him in that gray and ghastly death gloom of the cavern. He brought out his watch, and in the lantern glow they looked at it. 3:15, he said. By 4 o'clock they will be at work. Blackton and 20 men. They will have us out in time for supper. 3:15, repeated Joanne, and the words came steadily from her lips. That means, he waited. We have 45 minutes in which to live, she said. Before he could speak, she had thrust the lantern into his hand and had seized his other hand in both her own. If there are only 45 minutes, let us not lie to one another, she said, and her voice was very close. I know why you are doing it, John Aldous. It is for me. You have done a great deal for me in these 2 days in which one can be born and live and die. But in these last minutes I do not want you to act what I know cannot be the truth. You know, and I know. The wires are laid to the battery rock. There is no hope. At 4 o'clock we both know what will happen, and I am not afraid. She heard him choking for speech. In a moment he said, There are other lanterns, Joanne. I saw them when I was looking for the scarf. I will light them. He found 2 lanterns hanging against the rock wall. He lighted them, and the half-burned candle. It is pleasanter, she said. She stood in the glow of them when he turned to her, tall and straight and beautiful as an angel. Her lips were pale. The last drop of blood had ebbed from her face, but there was something glorious in the poise of her head, and in the wistful gentleness of her mouth and the light of her eyes. And then, slowly, as he stood looking with the face torn in its agony for her, she held out her arms. John Aldous? Joanne, oh my God, Joanne! She swayed as he sprang to her, but she was smiling in that new and wonderful way as her arms reached out to him, and the words he heard her say came low and sobbing. John, if you want to, now, you can tell me my hair is beautiful. And then she was in his arms, her warm, sweet body crushed close to him, her face lifted to him, her soft hands stroking his face over and over again. She was speaking his name, while from out of his soul there rushed forth the mighty flood of his great love, and he held her there, forgetful of time now, forgetful of death itself, and kissed her tender lips, her hair, her eyes, conscious only that in the hour of death he had found life, that her hands were stroking his face and caressing his hair, and that over and over again she was whispering sobbingly his name, and that she loved him. The pressure of her hands against his breast at last made him free her. And now, truly, she was glorious. For the triumph of love had overridden the despair of death, and her face was flooded with its color, and in her eyes was its glory. And then, as they stood there, a step between them, there came, almost like the benediction of a cathedral bell, the soft, low, tinkling chime of the half-hour bell in Aldous' watch. It struck him like a blow. Every muscle in him became like rigid iron, and his torn hands clenched tightly at his sides. Joanne, it is impossible, he cried huskily, and he had her close in his arms again, even as her face was whitening in the lantern glow. I have lived for you. I have waited for you. All these years you have been coming to me, and now you are mine. It is impossible. It cannot happen. He freed her again and caught up a lantern. Foot by foot he examined the packed tunnel. It was solid. Not a crevice or a break through which might have traveled the sound of his voice or the explosion of a gun. He did not shout. He knew that it would be hopeless, and that his voice would be terrifying in that sepulchral tomb. Was it possible that there might be some other opening, a possible exit, in that mountain wall? With the lantern in his hand, he searched. There was no break. He came back to Joanne. She was standing where he had left her, and suddenly, as he looked at her, all fear went out of him, and he put down the lantern and went to her. "Joanne," he whispered, holding her 2 hands against his breast. "You are not afraid?" "No, I am not afraid." "And you know?" "Yes, I know." And she leaned forward, so that her head lay partly against their clasped hands and partly upon his breast. "And you love me, Joanne?" "As I never dreamed that I should love a man, John Aldous," she whispered. "And yet it has been but 2 days, and I have lived an eternity." He heard her lips speak softly. "Would you be my wife?" "Yes." "Tomorrow?" "If you wanted me then, John." "I thank God," he breathed in her hair. "And would you come to me without reservation, Joanne, trusting me, believing in me? Would you come to me, body, heart, and soul?" "In all those ways, yes." "I thank God," he breathed again. He raised her face. He looked deep into her eyes, and the glory of her love grew in them, and her lips trembled as she lifted them ever so little for him to kiss. "Oh, I was happy, so happy," she whispered, putting her hands to his face. "John, I knew that you loved me, and oh, I was fighting so hard to keep myself from letting you know how happy it made me. And here I was afraid that you wouldn't tell me before it happened. And John, John." She leaned back from him, and her white hands moved like swift shadows in her hair, and then, suddenly, it billowed about her, her glorious hair, covering her from crown to hip, and with her hands she swept and piled the lustrous masses of it over him, until his face and head and shoulders were buried in the flaming sheen and sweet perfume of it. He strained her closer. Through the warm richness of her tresses, his lips pressed her lips, and they ceased to breathe, and up to their ears, pounding through that enveloping shroud of her hair, came the tick, tick, tick of the watch in his pocket. "Joanne," he whispered. "Yes, John?" "You're not afraid of death?" "No, not when you're holding me like this, John." He still clasped her hands, and a sweet smile crept over her lips. "Even now you are splendid," she said. "Oh, I would have you that way, my John." Again they stood up in the unsteady glow of the lanterns. "What time is it?" she asked. He drew out his watch, and as they both looked his blood ran cold. 12 minutes, she murmured, and there was not a quiver in her voice. "Let us sit down, John, you on this box and I on the floor at your feet, like this." He seated himself on the box, and Joanne nestled herself at his feet, her hands clasped in his. "I think, John," she said softly, "that very, very often we would have visited like this, you and I, in the evening." A lump choked him, and he could not answer. "I would very often have come and perched myself at your feet like this." "Yes, yes, my beloved." "And you would have always told me how beautiful my hair was, always. You would not have forgotten that, John, or have grown tired." "No, no, never." His arms were about her. He was drawing her closer. And we would have had beautiful times together, John, riding and going adventuring, and he felt her trembling, throbbing, and her arms tightened about him. And now, again, through the smother of her hair came the tick, tick, tick of his watch. He felt her fumbling at his pocket watch, and in a moment she was holding the timepiece between them so that the light of the lantern fell on the face of it. "It is 3 minutes of 4, John." The watch slipped from her fingers, and now she drew herself up so that her arms were about his neck and their faces touched. "Dear John, do you love me?" "So much that even now in the face of death I am happy," he whispered. "Joanne, sweetheart, we are not going to be separated. We are going together. Through all eternity it must be like this, you and I together. Little girl, wind your hair about me tight. There and there and there, John, I have tied you to me, and you are buried in it. Kiss me, John." And then the wild, terrible fear of a great loneliness swept through him, for Joanne's voice had died away in a whispering breath, and the lips he kissed did not kiss him back, and her body lay heavy, heavy, heavy in his arms. Yet in his loneliness he thanked God for bringing her oblivion in these last moments, and with his face crushed to hers he waited, for he knew it was no longer a matter of minutes, but seconds, and in those seconds he prayed, until up through the warm smother of her hair, with the clearness of a tolling bell, came the sound of a little gong in his watch, striking the hour of 4. In space other worlds might have crumbled into ruin. On earth the stories of empires might have been written, and the lives of men grown old in those first century-long seconds in which John Aldous held his breath and waited after the chiming of the hour bell in the watch on the cavern floor. How long he waited he did not know. How closely he was crushing Joanne to his breast he did not realize. Seconds, minutes, and other minutes, and his brain ran red in dumb, silent madness. And the watch, it ticked, ticked, ticked. It was like a hammer. He had heard the sound of it first coming up through her hair, but it was not in her hair now. It was over him, about him. It was no longer a ticking, but a throb, a steady, jarring, beating throb. It grew louder, and the air stirred with it. He lifted his head. With the eyes of a madman he stared and listened. His arms relaxed from about Joanne, and she slipped, crumbled and lifeless to the floor. He stared, and that steady beat, 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 100 times louder than the ticking of a watch, pounded in his brain. Was he mad? He staggered to the choked mouth of the tunnel, and then there fell shout upon shout and shriek upon shriek from his lips, and twice, like a madman now, he ran back to Joanne and caught her up in his arms, calling and sobbing her name, and then shouting and calling her name again. She moved. Her eyes opened, and like one gazing upon the spirit of the dead, she looked into the face of John Aldous, a madman's face in the lantern glow. "John? John?" She put up her hands, and with a cry he ran with her in his arms to the choked tunnel. "Listen! Listen!" he cried wildly. "Dear God in heaven! Joanne, can you not hear them? It's Blackton! Blackton and his men! Hear the rock hammers smashing! Joanne, Joanne, we are saved!" She did not sense him. She swayed, half on her feet, half in his arms, as consciousness and reason returned to her. Dazedly, her hands went to his face in their old, sweet way. Aldous saw her struggling to understand, to comprehend, and he kissed her soft, upturned lips fighting back the excitement that made him want to raise his voice again in wild and joyous shouting. "It is Blackton," he said over and over again. "It is Blackton and his men. Listen! You can hear their picks and the pounding of their rock hammers." End of chapter 19. Recording by Joanne Roshan.
Chapter 20 of The Hunted Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock. The Hunted Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 20. At last Joanne realized that the explosion was not to come, that Blackton and his men were working to save them, and now, as she listened with him, her breath began to come in sobbing excitement between her lips, for there was no mistaking that sound, that steady beat, 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 that came from beyond the cavern wall and seemed to set strange tremors stirring in the air about their ears. For a few moments they stood stunned and silent, as if not quite fully comprehending that they had come from out of the pit of death, and that men were fighting for their rescue. They asked themselves no questions. Why the coyote had not been fired? How those outside knew they were in the cavern? And as they listened, there came to them a voice. It was faint, so faint it seemed to whisper to them through miles and miles of space. Yet they knew that it was a voice. "Someone is shouting," spoke Aldous tensely. "Joanne, my darling, stand around the face of the wall so flying rock will not strike you, and I will answer with my pistol." When he had placed her in safety from split lead and rock chips, he drew his automatic and fired it close up against the choked tunnel. He fired 5 times steadily, counting 3 between each shot, and then he placed his ear to the mass of stone and earth and listened. Joanne slipped to him like a shadow. Her hand sought his, and they held their breaths. They no longer heard sounds, nothing but the crumbling and falling of dust and pebbles where the bullets had struck, and their own heartbeats. The picks and rock hammers had ceased. Tighter and tighter grew the clasp of Joanne's fingers, and a terrible thought flashed into John's brain. Perhaps a rock from the slide had cut a wire, and they had found the wire, had repaired it. Was that thought in Joan's mind too? Her fingernails pricked his flesh. He looked at her. Her eyes were closed and her lips were tense and gray. And then her eyes shot open, wide and staring. They heard faintly, though it came to them once, twice, 3 times, 4, 5, the firing of a gun. John Aldous straightened, and a great breath fell from his lips. 5 times he said, "It is an answer. There's no longer doubt." He was holding out his arms to her, and she came into them with a choking cry, and now she sobbed like a little child with her head against his breast, and for many minutes he held her close, kissing her wet face and her damp hair and her quivering lips, while the beat of the picks and the crash of the rock hammers came steadily nearer. Where those picks and rock hammers fell a score of men were working like fiends. Blackton, his arms stripped to the shoulders, Craig sweating and urging the men, and among them, lifting and tearing at the rock like a madman, old Donald MacDonald, his shirt open, his great hands bleeding, his hair and beard tossing about him in the wind. Behind them, her hands clasped to her breast, crying out to them to hurry, hurry, stood Peggy Blackton. The strength of 5 men was in every pair of arms. Huge boulders were rolled back. Men pawed earth and shale with their naked hands. Rock hammers fell with blows that would have cracked the heart of a granite obelisk. Half an hour, 3/4, and Blackton came back to where Peggy was standing, his face black and grimed, his arms red seared where the edges of the rocks had caught them, his eyes shining. "We're almost there, Peggy," he panted. "Another 5 minutes and—" A shout interrupted him. A cloud of dust rolled out of the mouth of the tunnel, and into that dust rushed half a dozen men led by old Donald. Before the dust had settled they began to reappear, and with a shrill scream Peggy Blackton darted forward and flung her arms about the gold-shrouded figure of Joanne, swaying and laughing and sobbing in the sunshine. And old Donald, clasping his great arms about Aldous, cried brokenly: "Oh, Johnny, Johnny, something told me to follow ye, and I was just in time to see you go into the coyote." "God bless you, Mac," said Aldous, and then Paul Blackton was wringing his hands, and one after another the others shook his hand, but Peggy Blackton was crying like a baby as she hugged Joanne in her arms. "MacDonald came just in time," explained Blackton a moment later, and he tried to speak steadily, and tried to smile. "10 minutes more and—" He was white. "Now that it has turned out like this, I thank God that it happened, Paul," said Aldous, for the engineer's ears only. "We thought we were facing death, and so I told her, and in there, on our knees, we pledged ourselves man and wife. I want the minister, as quick as you can get him, Blackton. Don't say anything to Joanne, but bring him to the house right away, will you?" "Within half an hour," replied Blackton. "There comes Tony with the buckboard. We'll hustle up to the house, and I'll have the preacher there in a jiffy." As they went to the wagon Aldous looked about for MacDonald. He had disappeared, requesting Craig to hunt him up and send him to the bungalow. He climbed into the back seat, with Joanne between them and Peggy. Her little hand lay in his, her fingers clung to him, but her hair hid her face, and on the other side of her Peggy Blackton was laughing and talking and crying by turns. As they entered the bungalow Aldous whispered to Joanne: "Will you please go right to your room, dear? I want to say something to you, alone." When she went up the stair Peggy caught a signal from her husband. Aldous remained with them. In 2 minutes he told the bewildered and finally delighted Peggy what was going to happen, and as Blackton hustled out for the minister's house he followed Joanne. She had fastened her door behind her. He knocked. Slowly she opened it. "John." "I have told them, dear," he whispered happily. "They understand. And Joanne, Paul Blackton will be back in 10 minutes. With the minister. Are you glad?" She had opened the door wide, and he was heading out his arms to her again. For a moment she did not move, but stood there trembling a little, and deeper and sweeter grew the colour in her face, and tenderer the look in her eyes. "I must brush my hair," she answered, as though she could think of no other words. I must dress." Laughing joyously, he went to her and gathered the soft masses of her hair in his hands, and piled it up in a glorious disarray about her face and head, holding it there, and still laughing into her eyes. "Joanne, you are mine. Unless I have been dreaming, I am John Aldous, forever and ever. Yes, forever and ever. And because I want the whole world to know, we are going to be married by a minister." She was silent. "And as my wife-to-be," he went on, his voice trembling with his happiness, "you must obey me." "I think I shall, John." "Then you will not brush your hair, and you will not change your dress, and you will not wash the dust from your face and that sweet little beauty spot from the tip of your nose," he commanded, and now he drew her head close to him, so that he whispered, half in her hair, "Joanne, my darling, I want you wholly as you came to me there, when we thought we were going to die. It was there you promised to become my wife, and I want you as you were then, when the minister comes. John, I think I hear someone coming up the front stairs." They listened. The door opened. They heard voices, Blackton's voice, Peggy's voice, and another voice, a man's voice. Blackton's voice came up to them very distinctly. "Mighty lucky, Peggy," he said. "Caught Mr. Wollaver just as he was passing the house. Where's—" "Shh!" came Peggy Blackton's sibilant whisper. Joanne's hands had crept to John's face. "I think," she said, "that it is the minister, John." Her warm lips were near, and he kissed them. "Come, Joanne, we'll go down." Hand in hand they went down the stairs, and when the minister saw Joanne, covered in the tangle and glory of her hair, and when he saw John Aldous with half-naked arms and blackened face, and when, with these things, he saw the wonderful joy shining in their eyes, he stood like one struck dumb at the sight of a miracle descending out of the skies. For never had Joanne looked more beautiful than in this hour, and never had man looked more like entering into paradise than John Aldous. Short and to the point was the little mountain minister's service, and when he had done he shook hands with them, and again he stared at them as they went back up the stair, still hand in hand. At her door they stopped. There were no words to speak now, as her heart lay against his heart, and her lips against his lips. And then, after those moments, she drew a little back, and there came suddenly that sweet, quivering, joyous play of her lips as she said, "And now, my husband, may I dress my hair?" "My hair," he corrected, and let her go from his arms. Her door closed behind her. A little dizzily he turned to his room. His hand was on the knob when he heard her speak his name. She had reopened her door, and stood with something in her hand, which she was holding toward him. He went back, and she gave him a photograph. "John, you will destroy this," she whispered. "It is his photograph, Mortimer FitzHugh's. I brought it to show to people that it might help me in my search. Please destroy it." He returned to his room and placed the photograph on his table. It was wrapped in thin paper, and suddenly there came upon him a most compelling desire to see what Mortimer FitzHugh had looked like in life. Joanne would not care. Perhaps it would be best for him to know. He tore off the paper, and as he looked at the picture the hot blood in his veins ran cold. He stared as if some wild and maddening joke was being played upon his faculties. A cry rose to his lips and broke in a gasping breath, and about him the floor, the world itself, seemed slipping away from under his feet. For the picture he held in his hand was the picture of Culver Rann. End of chapter 20.
Chapter 21 of The Hunted Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Johns, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Hunted Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 21. For a minute, perhaps longer, John Aldous stood staring at the photograph which he held in his hand. It was a picture of Culver Rann. Not once did he question that fact, and not once did the thought flash upon him that this might be only an unusual and startling resemblance. It was assuredly Culver Rann. The picture dropped from his hand to the table, and he went toward the door. His first impulse was to go to Joanne. But when he reached the door he locked it and dropped into a chair facing the mirror in his dresser. The reflection of his own face was a shock to him. If he was pale, the dust and grime of his fight in the cavern concealed his pallor, but the face that stared at him from out of the glass was haggard, wildly and almost grotesquely haggard, and he turned from it with a grim laugh and set his jaws hard. He returned to the table and bit by bit tore the photograph into thin shreds, and then piled the shreds on his ash tray and burned them. He opened a window to let out the smoke and smell of charring paper, and the fresh, cool air of early evening struck his face. He could look off through the fading sunshine of the valley and see the mountain where Coyote No. 28 was to have done its work, and as he looked he gripped the window sill so fiercely that the nails of his fingers were bent and broken against the wood. And in his brain the same words kept repeating themselves over and over again. Mortimer FitzHugh was not dead. He was alive. He was Culver Rann. And Joanne was not his wife. She was still the wife of Mortimer FitzHugh, of Culver Rann. He turned again to the mirror, and there was another look in his face. It was grim, terribly grim, and smiling. There was no excitement, nothing of the passion and half-madness with which he had faced Quade and Rann the night before. He laughed softly, and his nails dug as harshly into the palms of his hands as they had dug into the sills of the window. "You poor, driveling, cowardly fool," he said to his reflection, "and you dare to say, you dare to think that she is not your wife?" As if in reply to his words there came a knock at the door, and from the hall Blackton called, "Here's MacDonald, Aldous. He wants to see you." Aldous opened the door, and the old hunter entered. "If I ain't interruptin' you, Johnny." "You're the one man in the world I want to see, Mac." "No, I'll take that back. There's one other I want to see worse than you, Culver Rann." The strange look in his face made old Donald stare. "Sit down," he said, drawing 2 chairs close to the table. "There's something to talk about. It was a terribly close shave, wasn't it?" "An awful close shave, Johnny. As close a shave as ever was." Still, as if not quite understanding what he saw, old Donald was staring into John's face. "I'm glad it happened," said Aldous, and his voice became softer. "She loves me, Mac. It all came out when we were in there, and thought we were going to die. Not 10 minutes ago the minister was here, and he made us man and wife." Words of gladness that sprang to the old man's lips were stopped by that strange, cold, tense look in the face of John Aldous. "And in the last 5 minutes," continued Aldous, as quietly as before, "I have learned that Mortimer FitzHugh, her husband, is not dead. Is it very remarkable that you do not find me happy, Mac? If you had come a few minutes ago—" "Oh, my God, Johnny, Johnny!" MacDonald had pitched forward over the table, and now he bowed his great shaggy head in his hands, and his gaunt shoulders shook as his voice came brokenly through his beard. "I did it, Johnny. I did it for you and her. When I knew what it would mean for her, I couldn't, Johnny, I couldn't tell her the truth, 'cause I knew she loved you, and you loved her, and it would break her heart. I thought it would be best, and you'd go away together, and nobody would ever know, and you'd be happy. I didn't lie, I didn't say anything, but Johnny, Johnny, there weren't no bones in the grave." "My God!" breathed Aldous. "There were just some clothes," went on MacDonald huskily, "and the watch and the ring were on top. Johnny, there weren't nobody ever buried there, and I'm to blame. I'm to blame." "And you did that for us," cried Aldous, and suddenly he reached over and gripped old Donald's hands. "It wasn't a mistake, Mac. I thank God you kept silent. If you had told her that the grave was empty, that it was a fraud, I don't know what would have happened. And now she is mine. If she had ever seen Culver Rann, if she had discovered that this scoundrel, this blackmailer and murderer, was Mortimer FitzHugh, her husband—" "Johnny, John Aldous, Donald MacDonald's voice came now like the deep growling roar of a she-bear, and as he cried the other's name he sprang to his feet, and his eyes gleamed in their deep sockets like raging fires. "Johnny!" Aldous rose, and he was smiling. He nodded. "That's it," he said. "Mortimer FitzHugh is Culver Rann. And you know this?" "Absolutely. Joanne gave me Mortimer FitzHugh's photograph to destroy. I am sorry that I burned it before you saw it. But there is no doubt. Mortimer FitzHugh and Culver Rann are the same man." Slowly the old mountaineer turned to the door. Aldous was ahead of him, and stood with his hand on the knob. "I don't want you to go yet, Mac." I'll see you a little later," said Donald clumsily. "Donald!" "Johnny!" For a full half-minute they looked steadily into each other's eyes. "Only a week, Johnny," pleaded Donald. "I'll be back in a week." "You mean that you will kill him?" "He'll never come back. I swear it, Johnny." As gently as he might have led Joanne, Aldous drew the mountaineer back to the chair. "That would be cold-blooded murder," he said, "and I would be the murderer. I can't send you out to do my killing, Mac, as I might send out a hired assassin. Don't you see that I can't? Good heavens, some day, very soon, I will tell you how this hound, Mortimer FitzHugh, poisoned Joanne's life, and did his worst to destroy her. It's to me he's got to answer, Donald, and to me he shall answer. I am going to kill him, but it will not be murder. Since you have come into this room, I have made my final plan, and I shall follow it to the end, coolly and deliberately. It will be a great game, Mac, and it will be a fair game, and I shall play it happily, because Joanne will not know, and I will be strengthened by her love. Quade wants my life, and tried to hire Stevens up at Mietta to kill me. Culver Rann wants my life. A little later it will come to be the greatest desire of his existence to have me dead, and out of the way. I shall give him the chance to do the killing, Mac. I shall give him a splendid chance, and he will not fail to accept his opportunity. Perhaps he will have an advantage. But I am as absolutely certain of killing him as I am that the sun is going down behind the mountains out there. If others should step in, if I should have more than Culver Rann on my hands, why, then you may deal yourself a hand if you like, Donald. It may be a bigger game than 1 against 1. "It will," rumbled MacDonald. "I learned other things early this afternoon, Johnny. Quade did not stay behind. He went with Rann. DeBar and the woman are with them, and 2 other men. They went over the Lone Cache Pass, and this minute are hurrying straight for the headwaters of the Parsnip. There are 5 of them, 5 men." "And we are 2, smiled Aldous. "So there is an advantage on their side, isn't there, Mac? And it makes the game most eminently fair, doesn't it?" "Johnny, we're good for the 5, cried old MacDonald in a low, eager voice. "If we start now." "Can you have everything ready by morning?" "The outfit's waiting. It's ready now, Johnny." "Then we'll leave at dawn. I'll come to you tonight in the coulee, and we'll make our final plans. My brain is a little muddled now, and I've got to clear it, and make myself presentable before supper. We must not let Joanne know. She must suspect nothing, absolutely nothing." "Nothing," repeated MacDonald as he went to the door. There he paused, and, hesitating for a moment, leaned close to Aldous and said in a low voice, "Johnny, I've been wondering why the grave were empty. I've been wondering why there weren't somebody's bones there, just to give it the look it should 'a' had, and why the clothes were laid out so nicely, with the watch and the ring on top." With that he was gone, and Aldous closed and relocked the door. He was amazed at his own composure as he washed himself and proceeded to dress for supper. What had happened had stunned him at first, and even terrified him for a few appalling moments. Now he was superbly self-possessed. He asked himself questions and answered them with a promptness which left no room for doubt in his mind as to what his action should be. One fact he accepted as absolute: Joanne belonged to him. She was his wife. He regarded her as that, even though Mortimer FitzHugh was alive. In the eyes of both God and man, FitzHugh no longer had a claim upon her. This man, who was known as Culver Rann, was worse than Quade, a scoundrel of the first water, a procurer, a blackmailer, even a murderer, though he had thus far succeeded in evading the rather loose and poorly working tentacles of mountain law. Not for an instant did he think of Joanne as Culver Rann's wife. She was his wife. It was merely a technicality of the law, a technicality that Joanne might break with her little finger, that had risen now between them and happiness. And it was this that he knew was the mountain in his path, for he was certain that Joanne would not break that last link of bondage. She would know, with Mortimer FitzHugh alive, that the pledge between them in the Coyote and the marriage ceremony in the room below meant nothing. Legally, she was no more to him now than she was yesterday or the day before. And she would leave him, even if it destroyed her, heart and soul. He was sure of that. For years she had suffered her heart to be ground out of her because of the bit of madness that was in her, because of that earlier tragedy in her life, and her promise, her pledge to her father, her God, and herself. Without arguing a possible change in her because of her love for him, John Aldous accepted these things. He believed that if he told Joanne the truth, he would lose her. His determination not to tell her, to keep from her the secret of the grave and the fact that Mortimer FitzHugh was alive, grew stronger in him with each breath that he drew. He believed that it was the right thing to do, that it was the honorable and the only thing to do. Now that the first shock was over, he did not feel that he had lost Joanne, or that there was a very great danger of losing her. For a moment it occurred to him that he might turn the law upon Culver Rann, and in the same breath he laughed at this absurdity. The law could not help him. He alone could work out his own and Joanne's salvation. And what was to happen must happen very soon, up in the mountains. When it was all over, and he returned, he would tell Joanne. His heart beat more quickly as he finished dressing. In a few minutes more he would be with Joanne, and in spite of what had happened, and what might happen, he was happy. Yesterday he had dreamed. Today was reality, and it was a glorious reality. Joanne belonged to him. She loved him. She was his wife. And when he went to her, it was with the feeling that only a serpent lay in the path of their paradise, a serpent which he could crush with as little compunction as that serpent would have destroyed her. Utterly and remorselessly, his mind was made up. The Blackton supper hour was 5:30, and he was a quarter of an hour late when he tapped at Joanne's door. He felt the warmth of a strange and delightful embarrassment flushing his face as the door opened, and she stood before him. In her face, too, was a telltale riot of color, which the deep tan partly concealed in his own. I am a little late, am I not, Joanne?" he asked. "You are, sir. If you have taken all this time dressing, you are worse than a woman. I have been waiting 15 minutes. Old Donald came to see me," he apologized. "Joanne." "You mustn't, John," she expostulated in a whisper. "My face is afire now. You mustn't kiss me again until after supper." "Only once," he pleaded. "If you will promise, just once." A moment later she gasped. 5 times, John Aldous. I will never believe you again as long as I live." They went down to the Blacktons, and Peggy and Paul, who were busy over some growing geraniums in the dining-room window, faced about with a forced and incongruous appearance of total oblivion to everything that had happened. It lasted less than 10 seconds. Joanne's lips quivered. Aldous saw the 2 little dimples at the corners of her mouth, fighting to keep themselves out of sight. And then he looked at Peggy. Blackton could stand it no longer, and grinned broadly. "For goodness' sake, go to it, Peggy," he laughed. "If you don't, you'll explode." The next moment Peggy and Joanne were in each other's arms, and the 2 men were shaking hands. "We know just how you feel," Blackton tried to explain. "We felt it just like you do, only we had to face 20 people instead of 2. And you're not hungry, I'll wager that. I'll bet you don't feel like swallowing a mouthful. It had that peculiar effect on us, didn't it, Peggy? And I almost choked myself, gurgled Peggy, as they took their places at the table. There really did seem to be something thick in my throat, Joanne, dear. I coughed and coughed and coughed before all those people until I wanted to die right there. And I'm wondering if I'm going to choke too, smiled Joanne. Indeed not, Peggy. I'm as hungry as a bear. And now she did look glorious and self-possessed to Aldous as she sat opposite him at that small round table, which was just fitted for 4. He told her so when the meal was finished, and they were following the Blacktons into the front room. Blackton had evidently been carefully drilled along the line of a certain scheme which Peggy had formed, for in spite of a negative nod from her which signified that he was to wait a while, he pulled out his watch and said, "It isn't at all surprising if you people have forgotten that tomorrow is Sunday. Peggy and I always do some Saturday night shopping, and if you don't mind, we'll leave you to care for the house while we go to town. We won't be gone more than an hour." A few minutes later, when the door had closed behind them, Aldous led Joanne to a divan and sat down beside her. "I couldn't have arranged it better myself, dear," he exclaimed. "I have been wondering how I could have you alone for a few minutes and tell you what is on my mind before I see MacDonald again tonight. I'm afraid you will be displeased with me, Joanne. I hardly know how to begin, but I've got to." A moment's uneasiness came into her eyes as she saw how seriously he was speaking. "You don't mean, John, there's more about Quade and Culver Rann?" No, nothing like that," he laughed, as though amused at the absurdity of her question. "Old MacDonald tells me they have skipped the country, Joanne. It's not that. It's you I'm thinking of, and what you may think of me a minute from now. Joanne, I've given my word to old Donald. He has lived in my promise. I've got to keep that promise. I must go into the North with him." She had drawn one of his hands into her lap and was fondling it with her own soft palm and fingers. "Of course you must, John. I love old Donald." "And I must go soon," he added. "It is only fair to him that you should," she agreed. He is determined we shall go in the morning," he finished, keeping his eyes from her. For a moment Joanne did not answer. Her fingers interweaved with his, her warm little palm stroked the rough back of his hand. Then she said very softly, "And why do you think that will displease me, John dear? I will be ready." "You?" Her eyes were on him, full and dark and glowing, and in them were both love and laughter. "You dear silly John," she laughed. "Why don't you come right out and tell me to stay at home, instead of beating round the bush, as Peggy Blackton says? Only you don't know what a terrible little person you've got, John. You really don't. So you needn't say any more. We'll start in the morning, and I am going with you." In a flash John Aldous saw his whole scheme shaking on its foundation. "It's impossible, utterly impossible," he gasped. "And why utterly?" she asked, bending her head so that all her soft hair touched his face and lips. "John, have you already forgotten what we said in that terrible cavern, what we told ourselves we would have done if we had lived? We were going adventuring, weren't we? And we are not dead, but alive, and this will be a glorious trip. Why, John, don't you see, don't you understand? It will be our honeymoon trip." "It will be a long, rough journey," he argued. "It will be hard, hard for a woman." With a little laugh Joanne sprang up and stood before him in a glow of light, tall and slim and splendid, and there was a sparkle of beautiful defiance and a little of triumph in her eyes as she looked down on him. "And it will be dangerous, too. You are going to tell me that?" "Yes, it will be dangerous." She came to him and rumpled up his hair and turned his face up so that she could look into his eyes. "Is it worse than fever and famine and deep swamps and crawling jungles?" she asked. "Are we going to encounter worse things than beasts and poisonous serpents and murderous savages, even hunger and thirst, John? For many years we dared those together, my father and I. Are these great, big, beautiful mountains more treacherous than those Ceylon jungles from which you ran away, even you, John? Are they more terrible to live in than the great African desert? Are your bears worse than tigers, your wolves more terrible than lions? And if, though years and years, I face those things with my father, do you suppose that I want to be left behind now? And by my husband? So sweet and wonderful was the sound of that name, as it came softly from her lips, that in his joy he forgot the part he was playing, and drew her close down in his arms. And in that moment all that remained of the scheme he had built for keeping her behind crumbled in ruin about him. Yet in a last effort he persisted. "Old Donald wants to travel fast, very fast, Joanne. I owe a great deal to him. Even you I owe to him, for he saved us from the coyote. I am going, John. If we went alone we would be able to return very soon. I am going. And some of the mountains, it is impossible for a woman to climb them. Then I will let you carry me up them, John. You are so strong." He groaned hopelessly. "Joanne, won't you stay with the Blacktons to please me?" "No, I don't care to please you." Her fingers were stroking his cheek. "John?" "Yes." "Father taught me to shoot, and as we get better acquainted on our honeymoon trip, I'll tell you about some of my hunting adventures. I don't like to shoot wild things, because I love them too well, but I can shoot, and I want a gun." "Great Scott! Not a toy, but a real gun," she continued, "a gun like yours. And then, if by any chance we should have trouble with Culver Rann—" She felt him start, and her hands pressed harder against his face. "Now I know," she whispered. "I guessed it all along. You told me that Culver Rann and the others were after the gold. They've gone, and their going isn't quite skipping the country, as you meant me to understand it, John Aldous. So please let's not argue any more. If we do, we may quarrel, and that would be terrible. I'm going, and I will be ready in the morning, and I want a gun. And I want you to be nice to me, and I want it to be our honeymoon, even if it is going to be exciting." And with that she put her lips to his, and his last argument was gone. 2 hours later, when he went to the coulee, he was like one who had come out of a strange and disturbing and altogether glorious dream. He had told Joanne and the Blacktons that it was necessary for him to be with MacDonald that night. Joanne's good-night kiss was still warm on his lips, the loving touch of her hand still trembled on his face, and the sweet perfume of her hair was in his nostrils. He was drunk with the immeasurable happiness that had come to him. Every fiber in him was aquiver with it, and yet, possessed of his great joy, he was conscious of a fear that was new and growing, and which made him glad when he came at last to the little fire in the coulee. He did not tell MacDonald the cause of his fear at first. He told the story of Mortimer Fitzhugh and Joanne, leaving no part of it unbarred, until he could see Donald MacDonald's great gaunt hands clenching in the firelight, and his cavernous eyes flaming darkly through the gloom. Then he told what had happened when the Blacktons went to town, and when he had finished and rose despairingly beside the fire, Donald rose too, and his voice boomed in a sort of ecstasy. "My Jane would 'a' done likewise," he cried in triumph. "She would that, Johnny, she would." "But this is different," groaned Aldous. "What am I going to do, Mac? What can I do? Don't you see how impossible it is? Mac, she isn't my wife, not entirely, not absolutely, not in the last and vital sense of being a wife by law. If she knew the truth, she wouldn't consider herself my wife. She would leave me. For that reason I can't take her. I can't. Think what it would mean." Old Donald had come close to his side, and at the look in the gray old mountaineer's face, John Aldous paused. Slowly Donald laid his hands on his shoulders. "Johnny," he said gently, "Johnny, be you sure of yourself? Be you a man, Johnny?" "Good heaven, Donald! You mean—" Their eyes met steadily. "If you are, Johnny," went on MacDonald in a low voice, "I'd take her with me. And if you ain't, I'd leave those mountains to-night and never look in her sweet face again as long as I lived." "You'd take her along?" demanded Aldous eagerly. "I would. I've been thinking it over to-night, and something seemed to tell me we mustn't dare leave her here alone. There's just two things to do, Johnny. You've got to stay with her and let me go on alone, or you've got to take her." Slowly Aldous shook his head. He looked at his watch. It was a little after 10. "If I could make myself believe that she would not be safe here, I would take her," he said. "But I can't quite make up my mind to that, Mac. She will be in good hands with the Blacktons. I will warn Paul. Joanne is determined to go, and I know she will think it pretty indecent to be told emphatically that she can't go. But I've got to do it. I can't see—" A break in the stillness of the night stopped him with the suddenness of a bullet in his brain. It was a scream, a woman's scream, and there followed it shriek after shriek, until the black forest trembled with the fear and agony of the cries, and John Aldous stood as if suddenly stripped of the power to move or act. Donald MacDonald roused him to life. With a roar in his beard he sprang forth into the darkness, and Aldous followed, a hot sweat of fear in his blood, where a moment before had been only a chill of wonder and horror. For in Donald's savage, beast-like cry he had caught Joanne's name, and an answering cry broke from his own lips as he followed the great, gaunt form that was tearing with the madness of a wounded bear ahead of him through the night. End of Chapter 21. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Chapter 22 of The Hunted Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Hunted Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 22. Not until they had rushed up out of the coulee and had reached the path-like trail did the screaming cease. For barely an instant MacDonald paused, and then ran on with a speed that taxed Aldous to keep up. When they came to the little open amphitheater in the forest, MacDonald halted again. Their hearts were thumping like hammers, and the old mountaineer's voice came husky and choking when he spoke. "It wasn't far from here," he panted. Scarcely had he uttered the words when he sped on again. 3 minutes later they came to where the trail crossed the edge of a small, rock-cluttered meadow, and with a sudden spurt Aldous darted ahead of MacDonald into this opening, where he saw two figures in the moonlight. Half a dozen feet from them he stopped with a cry of horror. They were Paul and Peggy Blackton. Peggy was disheveled and sobbing, and was frantically clutching at her husband. It was Paul Blackton who dragged the cry from his lips. The contractor was swaying. He was hatless. His face was covered with blood, and his eyes were only half open, as if he were fighting to pull himself back into consciousness after a terrible blow. Peggy's hair was down, her dress was torn at the throat, and she was panting so that for a moment she could not speak. "They've got Joanne!" she cried then. "They went there!" She pointed, and Aldous ran where she pointed, into the timber on the far side of the little meadow. MacDonald caught his arm as they ran. "You go straight in," he commanded. "I'll swing to right toward river." For 2 minutes after that Aldous tore straight ahead. Then for barely a moment he stopped. He had not paused to question Peggy Blackton. His own fears told him who Joanne's abductors were. They were men working under instructions from Quade, and they could not be far away, for scarcely 10 minutes had passed since the first scream. He listened and held his breath so that the terrific beating of his heart would not drown the sound of crackling brush. All at once the blood in him was frozen by a fierce yell. It was MacDonald, a couple of 100 yards to his right. And after that yell came the bellowing shout of his name. "Johnny! Johnny! Oh, Johnny!" He dashed in MacDonald's direction, and a few moments later he heard the crashing of bodies in the undergrowth. 50 seconds more and he was in the arena. MacDonald was fighting 3 men in a space over which the spruce tops grew thinly. The moon shone upon them as they swayed in a struggling mass, and as Aldous sprang to the combat, one of the 3 reeled backward and fell as if struck by a battering ram. In the same moment MacDonald went down, and Aldous struck a terrific blow with the butt of his heavy Savage. He missed, and the momentum of his blow carried him over MacDonald. He tripped and fell. By the time he had regained his feet, the two men had disappeared into the thick shadows of the spruce forest. Aldous whirled toward the third man whom he had seen fall. He, too, had disappeared. A little lamely old Donald brought himself to his feet. He was smiling. "Now what do ye think, Johnny?" "Where is she? Where is Joanne?" demanded Aldous. 20 feet behind you, Johnny, gagged and trussed up nice as a whistle. If they hadn't stopped to do that work, you wouldn't have seen her again, Johnny. So help me God, you wouldn't. They was hiking for the river. Once they reached the Fraser and a boat." He broke off to lead Aldous to a clump of dwarf spruce. Behind this, white and still in the moonlight, but with eyes wide open and filled with horror, lay Joanne. Hands and feet were bound, and a big handkerchief was tied over her mouth. 20 seconds later Aldous held her shivering and sobbing and laughing hysterically by turns in his arms, while MacDonald's voice brought Paul and Peggy Blackton to them. Blackton had recovered from the blow that had dazed him. Over Joanne's head he stared at Aldous, and MacDonald was staring at Blackton. His eyes were burning a little darkly. "It'll all come out right," he said. "But it ain't a special nice time o' night to be takin' a evening walk in this locality with a couple o' ladies." Blackton was still staring at Aldous, with Peggy clutching his arm as if afraid of losing him. It was Peggy who answered MacDonald. "And it was a nice time of night for you to send a message asking us to bring Joanne down the trail," she cried, her voice trembling. "We—" began Aldous, when he saw a sudden warning movement on MacDonald's part, and stopped. "Let us take the ladies home," he said. With Joanne clinging to him, he led the way. Behind them all, MacDonald growled loudly. "There's got to be somethin' done with these damned beasts of furriners. It's gettin' so no woman ain't safe at night." 20 minutes later they reached the bungalow. Leaving Joanne and Peggy inside, now as busily excited as two phoebe birds, and after Joanne had insisted upon Aldous sleeping at the Blacktons' that night, the two men accompanied MacDonald a few steps on his way back to camp. As soon as they were out of earshot, Blackton began cursing softly under his breath. "So you didn't send that damned note?" he asked. "You haven't said so, but I've guessed you didn't send it." "No, we didn't send a note." "And you had a reason, you and MacDonald, for not wanting the girls to know the truth?" "A mighty good reason," said Aldous. "I've got to thank MacDonald for closing my mouth at the right moment. I was about to give it away. And now, Blackton, I've got to confide in you. But before I do that I want your word that you will repeat nothing of what I say to another person, even your wife." Blackton nodded. "Go on," he said. "I've suspected a thing or two, Aldous. I'll give you my word. Go on." As briefly as possible, and without going deeply into detail, Aldous told of Quade and his plot to secure possession of Joanne. "And this is his work," he finished. "I've told you this, Paul, so that you won't worry about Peggy. You can see from tonight's events that they were not after her, but wanted Joanne. Joanne must not learn the truth, and your wife must not know. I am going to settle with Quade. Just how and where and when I'm going to settle with him I don't care to say now, but he's going to answer to me, and he's going to answer soon." Blackton whistled softly. "A boy brought the note," he said. "He stood in the dark when he handed it to me, and I didn't recognize any one of the three men who jumped out on us. I didn't have much of a chance to fight, but if there's any one on the face of the earth who has got it over Peggy when it comes to screaming, I'd like to know her name." Joanne didn't have time to make a sound, but they didn't touch Peggy until she began screaming, and then one of the men began choking her. They had about laid me out with a club, so I was helpless. Good God!" He shuddered. "They were river men," said MacDonald. "Probably some of Toman's scowmen. They were making for the river." A few minutes later, when Aldous was saying good night to MacDonald, the old hunter said again in a whisper, "Now what do ye think, Johnny?" "That you're right, Mac," replied Aldous in a low voice. "There is no longer a choice. Joanne must go with us. You will come early?" "At dawn, Johnny." He returned to the bungalow with Blackton, and until midnight the lights were there burning brightly, while the two men answered 1,000 questions about the night's adventure, and Aldous told of his and Joanne's plans for the honeymoon trip into the north that was to begin the next day. It was 12:30 when he locked the door of his and sat down to think. End of chapter 22. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah.
Chapter 23 of The Hunted Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock. The Hunted Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 23. There was no doubt in the mind of John Aldous now. The attempt upon Joanne left him but one course to pursue. He must take her with him, in spite of the monumental objections which he had seen a few hours before. He realized what a fight this would mean for him, and with that cleverness and resource he must play his part. Joanne had not given herself to him as she had once given herself to Mortimer FitzHugh in the Coyote, when they had faced death. She had told him that were there to be a tomorrow in life for them, she would have given herself to him utterly and without reservation. And that tomorrow had dawned. It was present. She was his wife. And she had come to him as she had promised. In her eyes he had seen love and trust and faith, and a glorious happiness. She had made no effort to hide that happiness from him. Consciousness of it filled him with his own great happiness, and yet it made him realize even more deeply how hard his fight was to be. She was his wife. In 100 little ways she had shown him that she was proud of her wifehood, and again he told himself that she had come to him as she had promised, that she had given into his keeping all that she had to give, and yet she was not his wife. He groaned aloud, and his fingers dug into the flesh of his knees as he thought of that. Could he keep that terrible truth from her if she went with him into the north? Would she not guess? And even though he kept the truth from her until Mortimer FitzHugh was dead, would he be playing fair with her? Again he went over all that he had gone over before. He knew that Joanne would leave him tomorrow, and probably forever, if he had told her that FitzHugh was alive. The law could not help him, for only death and never divorce would free her. Within himself he decided for the last time. He was about to do the one thing left for him to do, and it was the honorable thing, for it meant freedom for her and happiness for them both. To him, Donald MacDonald had become a man who lived very close to the heart and the right of things, and Donald had said that he should take her. This was the greatest proof that he was right. But could he keep Joanne from guessing? Could he keep her from discovering the truth until it was time for her to know that truth? In this necessity of keeping her from suspecting that something was wrong, he saw his greatest fight. Compared with it, the final settlement with Quade and Mortimer FitzHugh sank into a second importance. He knew what would happen then, but Joanne on the trail as his wife. He began pacing back and forth in his room, clouding himself in the smoke of his pipe. Frequently Joanne's mind had filled him with an exquisite delight by its quickness and at times almost magic perceptiveness, and he realized that in these things and the fineness of her woman intuition now lay his greatest menace. He was sure that she understood the meaning of the assault upon her that night, though she had apparently believed what he and Blackton had told them, that it had been the attack of irresponsible and drunken hoodlums. Yet he was certain that she had already guessed that Quade had been responsible. He went to bed, dreading what questions and new developments the morning might bring forth, and when the morning came he was both amazed and delighted. The near tragedy of the previous night might never have happened in so far as he could judge from Joanne's appearance. When she came out of her room to meet him, in the glow of the hall lamp, her eyes were like stars, and the colour in her cheeks was like that of a rose fresh from its slumber in dew. "I'm so happy, and what happened last night seems so like a bad dream," she whispered, as he held her close to him for a few moments before descending the stairs. "I shall worry about Peggy, John. I shall. I don't understand how her husband dares to bring her among savages like these. You wouldn't leave me among them, would you?" And as she asked the question, and his lips pressed hers, John Aldous still believed that in her heart she knew the truth of that night attack. If she did know, she kept her secret from him all that day. They left Tête Jaune before sunlight with an outfit which MacDonald had cut down to 6 horses. Its smallness roused Joanne's first question, for Aldous had described to her an outfit of 20 horses. He explained that a large outfit might travel much more difficult and slow, but he did not tell her that with 6 horses instead of 20 they could travel less conspicuously, more easily conceal themselves from enemies, and, if necessary, make quick flight or swift pursuit. They stopped to camp for the night in a little basin that drew from Joanne an exclamation of joy and wonder. They had reached the upper timberline, and on 3 sides the basin was shut in by treeless and bush-naked walls of mountains. In the centre of the dip was a lake fed by a tiny stream that fell in a series of ribbon-like cataracts a sheer 1,000 feet from the snow peaks that towered above them. Small, park-like clumps of spruce dotted the miniature valley. Over it hung a sky as blue as sapphire, and under their feet was a carpet of soft grass sprayed with little blue forget-me-nots and wild aster. "I have never seen anything half so beautiful as this," cried Joanne, as Aldous helped her from her horse. As her feet touched the ground she gave a little cry and hung limply in his arms. "I'm lame, lame for life," she laughed in mock humour. "John, I can't stand. I really can't." Old Donald was chuckling in his beard as he came up. "You ain't nearly so lame as you'll be tomorrow," he comforted her. "And you won't be nearly so lame tomorrow as you'll be the next day. Then you'll begin to get used to it, Miss Joanne." "Mrs. Aldous, Donald," she corrected sweetly. "Or just Joanne." At that Aldous found himself holding her so closely that she gave a little gasp. "Please don't," she expostulated. "Your arms are terribly strong, John." MacDonald had turned away, still chuckling, and began to unpack. Joanne looked behind her, then quickly held up her softly pouted lips. Aldous kissed her, and would have kissed her again, but she slipped suddenly from his arms, and going to Pinto, began to untie a dishpan that was fastened to the top of his pack. "Get to work, John Aldous," she commanded. MacDonald had camped before in the basin, and there were tepee poles ready cut, as light and dry as matchwood. Joanne watched them as they put up the tent, and when it was done and she looked inside, she cried delightedly, "It is the snuggest little home I ever had, John." After that she busied herself in a way that was a constantly growing pleasure to him. She took possession at once of pots and pans and kettles. She lost no time in impressing upon both Aldous and MacDonald the fact that while she was their docile follower on the trail, she was to be the head of affairs in camp. While they were straightening out the outfit, hobbling the horses, and building a fire, she rummaged through the panniers and took stock of their provisions. She bossed old Donald in a manner that made him fairly glow with pleasure. She bared her white arms to the elbows and made biscuits for the reflector instead of bannock, while Aldous brought water from the lake, and MacDonald cut wood. Her cheeks were aflame. Her eyes were laughing, joyous, happy. MacDonald seemed years younger. He obeyed her like a boy, and once Aldous caught him looking at her in a way that set him thinking again of those days of years and years ago, and of other camps, and of another woman, like Joanne. MacDonald had thought of this first camp, and there were porterhouse steaks for supper, which he had brought packed in a kettle of ice. When they sat down to the meal, Joanne was facing a distant snow-capped ridge that cut the skyline, and the last of the sun, reflected from the face of the mountain on the east, had set brown and gold fires aglow in her hair. They were partly through when her eyes rested on a distant snow ridge. Aldous saw her looking steadily. Suddenly she pointed beyond him. "I see something moving over the snow on that mountain," she cried a little excitedly. "It is hurrying towards the summit, just under the skyline. What is it?" Aldous and MacDonald looked toward the ridge. Fully a mile away, almost even with the skyline now, a small dark object was moving over the white surface of the snow. "It ain't a goat," said MacDonald, "because a goat is white, and we couldn't see it on the snow. It ain't a sheep, 'cause it's too dark, and moving too slow. It must be a bear, but why in the name of sin a bear would be that high, I don't know." He jumped up and ran for his telescope. "A grizzly," whispered Joanne tensely. "Would it be a grizzly, John?" "Possibly," he answered. "Indeed, it's very likely. This is a grizzly country. If we hurry we can get a look at him through the telescope." MacDonald was already studying the object through his long glass when they joined him. "It's a bear," he said. "Please, please let me look at him," begged Joanne. The dark object was now almost on the skyline. Half a minute more and it would pass over and out of sight. MacDonald still held his eye to the telescope, as though he had not heard Joanne. Not until the moving object had crossed the skyline and had disappeared did he reply to her. "The light's bad, and you couldn't have made him out very well," he said. "We'll show you plenty of grizzlies, and so near you won't want a telescope. Eh, Johnny?" As he looked at Aldous there was a strange look in his eyes, and during the remainder of the supper he was restless, and ate hurriedly. When he had finished he rose and picked up his long rifle. "There's sheep somewhere near this basin, Johnny," he explained, "and I reckon Joanne will scold us if we don't keep her in fresh meat. I'm going to bring in some mutton if there's any to be got, and I probably won't be back until after dark." Aldous knew that he had more to say, and he went with him a few steps beyond the camp, and MacDonald continued in a low, troubled voice: "Be careful, Johnny. Watch yourself. I'm going to take a look over into the next valley, and I won't be back until late. It wasn't a goat, and it wasn't a sheep, and it wasn't a bear. It was two-legged. It was a man, Johnny, and he was there to watch this trail, or my name ain't Donald MacDonald. Maybe he came ahead of us last night, and maybe he was here before that happened. Anyway, be on your guard while I look over into the next range." With that he struck off in the direction of the snow ridge, and for a few moments Aldous stood looking after the tall, picturesque figure until it disappeared behind a clump of spruce. Swiftly he was telling himself that it was not the hunting season, and that it was not a prospector whom they had seen on the snow ridge. As a matter of caution, there could be but one conclusion to draw. The man had been stationed there either by Quade or Fitzhugh, or both, and had unwittingly revealed himself. He turned toward Joanne, who had already begun to gather up the supper things. He could hear her singing happily, and as he looked she pressed a finger to her lips and threw a kiss to him. His heart smote him even as he smiled and waved a hand in response. Then he went to her. How slim and wonderful she looked in that glow of the setting sun, he thought. How white and soft were her hands, how tender and fragile her lovely neck, and how helpless, how utterly helpless she would be if anything happened to him and MacDonald. With an effort he flung the thought from him. On his knees he wiped the dishes and pots and pans for Joanne. When this was done he seized an axe and showed her how to gather a bed. This was a new and delightful experience for Joanne. "You always want to cut the balsam boughs when you can get them," he explained, pausing before two small trees. "Now this is a cedar and this is a balsam. Notice how prickly and needle-like on all sides these cedar branches are. And now look at the balsam. The needles lay flat and soft. Balsam makes the best bed you can get in the north, except moss, and you've got to dry the moss." For 15 minutes he clipped off the soft ends of the balsam limbs, and Joanne gathered them in her arms and carried them into the tepee. Then he went in with her and showed her how to make the bed. He made it a narrow bed and a deep bed, and he knew that Joanne was watching him, and he was glad the tan hid the uncomfortable glow in his face when he had finished tucking in the end of the last blanket. "You will be as cozy as can be in that," he said. "And you, John?" she asked, her face flushing rosily. "I haven't seen another tent for you and Donald." "We don't sleep in a tent during the summer," he said. "Just our blankets, out in the open." "But if it should rain?" "We get under a balsam or a spruce or a thick cedar." A little later they stood beside the fire. It was growing dusk. The distant snow ridge was swiftly fading into a pale and ghostly sheet in the grey gloom of the night. Up that ridge Aldous knew that MacDonald was toiling. Joanne put her hands to his shoulder. "Are you sorry, so very, very sorry that you let me come, John?" "I didn't let you come," he laughed softly, drawing her to him. "You came." "And are you sorry?" "No." It was deliciously sweet to have her tilt up her head and put her soft lips to his. And it was still sweeter when her tender hands stroked his cheeks, and eyes and lips smiled their love and gladness. He stood stroking her hair, with her face laying warm and close against him, and over her head he stared into the thickening darkness of the spruce and cedar copses. Joanne herself had piled wood on the fire, and in its glow they were dangerously illuminated. With one of her hands she was still caressing his cheek. "When will Donald return?" she asked. "Probably not until late," he replied, wondering what it was that had set a stone rolling down the side of the mountain nearest to them. "He hunted until dark, and may wait for the moon to come up before he returns." "John." "Yes, dear?" And mentally he measured the distance to the nearest clump of timber before them and the mountain. "Let's build a big fire and sit down on the pannier canvases." His eyes were still on the timber, and he was wondering what a man with a rifle, or even a pistol, might do at that pace. He made a good target, and MacDonald was probably several miles away. "I've been thinking about the fire," he said. "We must put it out, Joanne. There are reasons why we should not let it burn. For one thing, the smoke will drive any game away that we may hope to see in the morning." Her hands lay still against his cheek. "I understand, John," she replied quickly, and there was the smallest bit of shudder in her voice. "I had forgotten. We must put it out." 5 minutes later only a few glowing embers remained where the fire had been. He had spread out the pannier canvases, and now he seated himself with his back to a tree. Joanne snuggled close to him. "It is much nicer in the dark," she whispered, and her arms reached up about him, and her lips pressed warm and soft against his hand. "Are you just a little ashamed of me, John?" "Ashamed? Good heaven!" "Because," she interrupted him, "we have known each other such a very short time, and I have allowed myself to become so very, very well acquainted with you. It has all been so delightfully sudden and strange, and I am just as happy as I can be. You don't think it is immodest for me to say these things to my husband, John, even if I have only known him 3 days?" He answered by crushing her so closely in his arms that for a few moments afterwards she lay helplessly on his breast, gasping for breath. His brain was afire with the joyous madness of possession. Never had a woman come to a man more sweetly than Joanne had come to him, and as he felt her throbbing and trembling against him, he was ready to rise up and shout forth a challenge to 100 Quades and Culverans hiding in the darkness of the mountains. For a long time he held her nestled close in his arms, and at intervals there were silences between them, in which they listened to the glad tumult of their own hearts, and the strange silence that came to them from out of the still night. It was their first hour alone, of utter oblivion to all else but themselves. To Joanne the first sacrament hour of her wifehood, to him the first hour of perfect possession and understanding. In that hour their souls became one, and when at last they rose to their feet, and the moon came over a crag of the mountain and flooded them in its golden light, there was in Joanne's face a tenderness and a gentle glory that made John Aldous think of an angel. He led her to the tepee and lighted a candle for her, and at the last, with the sweet demand of a child in the manner of her doing it, she pursed up her lips to be kissed good night. And when he had tied the tent flap behind her, he took his rifle and sat down with it across his knees in the deep black shadow of a spruce, and waited and listened for the coming of Donald MacDonald. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of The Hunted Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joanne Rochon. The Hunted Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 24. For an hour after Joanne had gone into her tent, Aldous sat silent and watchful. From where he had concealed himself he could see over a part of the moonlit basin, and guard the open space between the camp and the clump of timber that lay in the direction of the nearest mountain. After Joanne had blown out her candle, the silence of the night seemed to grow deeper about him. The hobbled horses had wandered several 100 yards away, and only now and then could he hear the thud of a hoof or the clank of a steel shoe on rock. He believed that it was impossible for anyone to approach without ears and eyes giving him a warning, and he felt a distinct shock when Donald MacDonald suddenly appeared in the moonlight not 20 paces from him. With an ejaculation of amazement he jumped to his feet and went to him. "How the deuce did you get here?" he demanded. "Were you asleep, Johnny?" "I was awake and watching." The old hunter chuckled. "It was so still when I came up those trees back there that I thought maybe something had happened," he said. "So I sneaked up, Johnny." "Did you see anything over the range?" asked Aldous anxiously. "I found footprints in the snow, and when I got to the top I smelled smoke, but I couldn't see a fire. It was dark then." MacDonald nodded toward the tepee. "Is she asleep, Johnny?" "I think so. She must be very tired." They drew back into the shadow of the spruce. It was a simultaneous movement of caution, and both, without speaking their thoughts, realized the significance of it. Until now they had had no opportunity of being alone since last night. MacDonald spoke in a low, muffled voice. "Quade and Culver Rann are going the limit, Johnny," he said. "They left men on the job at St. Jean, and they've got others watching us. Consequently, I've hit on a scheme. A sort of simple and unreasonable scheme, maybe, but an awful good scheme at times." "What is it?" "Whenever you see anything that ain't a bear or a goat or a sheep, don't wait to change the time of day, but shoot," said MacDonald. Aldous smiled grimly. "If I had any ideas of chivalry, or what I call fair play, they were taken out of me last night, Mac," he said. "I'm ready to shoot on sight." MacDonald grunted his satisfaction. "They can't beat us if we do that, Johnny. They ain't even ordinary cutthroats. They're sneaking in the bargain, and if they could walk into our camp smiling and friendly and brain us when our backs was turned, they'd do it. We don't know who's with 'em, and if a stranger heaves in sight, meet him with a chunk of lead. They're the only ones in these mountains, and we won't make any mistake. See that bunch of spruce over there?" The old hunter pointed to a clump 50 yards beyond the tepee, toward the little lake. Aldous nodded. "I'll take my blankets over there," continued MacDonald. "You roll up here, and the tepee be between us. You see the system, Johnny? If they make us a visit during the night, we've got 'em between us, and there'll be some real burying to do in the morning." Back under the low-hanging boughs of the dwarf spruce, Aldous spread out his blanket a few minutes later. He had made up his mind not to sleep, and for hours he lay watchful and waiting, smoking occasionally, with his face close to the ground, so that the odor of the tobacco would cling to the earth. The moon rose until it was straight overhead, flooding the valley in a golden splendor that he wished Joanne might have seen. Then it began sinking into the west, slowly at first, then more swiftly its radiance diminished. He looked at his watch before the yellow orb effaced itself behind the towering peak of a distant mountain. It was 1:45. With deepening darkness his eyes grew heavier. He closed them for a few moments at a time, and each time the interval was longer, and it took greater effort to force himself into wakefulness. Finally he slept, but he was still subconsciously on guard, and an hour later that consciousness was beating and pounding within him, urging him to awake. He sat up with a start and gripped his rifle. An owl was hooting. Softly, very softly. There were 4 notes. He answered, and a little later MacDonald came like a shadow out of the gloom. Aldous advanced to meet him, and he noticed that over the eastern mountains there was a break of gray. "It's after 3, Johnny," MacDonald greeted him. "Build a fire and get breakfast. Tell Joanne I'm out after another sheep. Until it's good and light, I'm going to watch from that clump of timber up there. In half an hour it'll be dawn." He moved toward the timber, and Aldous set about building a fire. He was careful not to awaken Joanne. The fire was crackling cheerily when he went to the lake for water. Returning, he saw the faint glow of candlelight in Joanne's tepee. 5 minutes later she appeared, and all thought of danger and the discomfort of his sleepless night passed from him at the sight of her. Her eyes were still a little misty with sleep when he took her in his arms and kissed her, but she was deliciously alive and glad and happy. In one hand she had brought a brush, and in the other a comb. "You slept like a log," he cried happily. "It can't be that you had very bad dreams, little wife?" "I had a beautiful dream, John." She laughed softly, and the color flooded up into her face. She unplaited the thick silken strands of her braid, and began brushing her hair in the firelight while Aldous sliced the bacon. Some of the slices were thick and some were thin, for he could not keep his eyes from her as she stood there like a goddess, buried almost to her knees in that wondrous mantle. He found himself whistling with a very light heart as she braided her hair, and afterward plunged her face into the bath of cold water he had brought from the lake. From that bath she emerged like a glowing naiad. Her eyes sparkled, her cheeks were pink, and her lips full and red. Damp little tendrils of hair clung adorably about her face and neck. For another full minute Aldous paused in his labours, and he wondered if MacDonald was watching them from the clump of timber. The bacon was sputtering when Joanne ran to it and rescued it from burning. Dawn followed quickly after that first break of day in the east, but not until one could see a full rifle shot away did MacDonald return to the camp. Breakfast was waiting, and as soon as he had finished the old hunter went after the horses. It was 5 o'clock, and bars of the sun were shooting over the tops of the mountains, when once more they were in the saddle and on their way. Most of this day Aldous headed the outfit up the valley. On the pretext of searching for game, MacDonald rode so far in advance that only twice during the forenoon was he in sight. When they stopped to camp for the night, his horse almost exhausted, and MacDonald himself showed signs of tremendous physical effort, Aldous could not question him before Joanne. He waited, and MacDonald was strangely silent. The proof of MacDonald's prediction concerning Joanne was in evidence this second night. Every bone in her body ached, and she was so tired that she made no objection to going to bed as soon as it was dark. "It always happens like this," consoled old Donald as she bade him good night. "Tomorrow you'll be getting broke in, and the next day you won't have any lameness at all." She limped to the tepee with John's arm snugly about her slim waist. MacDonald waited patiently until he returned. He motioned Aldous to seat himself close at his side. Both men lighted their pipes before the mountaineer spoke. "We can't both sleep at once tonight, Johnny," he said. "We've got to take turns keeping watch." "You've discovered something today?" "No, it's what I haven't discovered that counts. There weren't no tracks in this valley, Johnny, from mountain to mountain. They haven't traveled through this range, and that leaves just two things for us to figure on. They're behind us, or DeBar is hitting another trail to the north. There isn't no danger ahead right now because we're getting into the biggest ranges between here and the Yukon. If Quade and Ran are in the next valley, they can't get over the mountains to get us. Quade, with all his flesh, couldn't climb over that range to the west of us 3 days, if he could get over it at all. They're hiking straight for the gold over another trail. Or they're behind us. And maybe both." "How both?" asked Aldous. "Two parties," explained MacDonald, puffing hard at his pipe. "If there's an outfit behind us, they were hid in the timber on the other side of the snow ridge, and they're pretty close this minute. Culver Ran, or Fitzhugh, as you call him, is hustling straight on with DeBar. Maybe Quade is with 'em, maybe he ain't. Anyway, there's a big chance of a bunch behind us, with special instructions from Quade to cut our throats and keep Joanne." That day Aldous had been turning a question over in his own mind. He asked it now. "Mac, are you sure you can go to the Valley of Gold without DeBar?" For a long half-minute MacDonald looked at him, and then his voice rumbled in a low, exultant laugh in his beard. "Johnny," he said with a strange quiver in his voice, "I can go to it now straighter and quicker than DeBar. I know why I never found it. DeBar helped me that much. The trail is mapped right out in my brain now, Johnny. 5 years ago I was within 10 miles of the cavern and didn't know it." "And we can get there ahead of them?" "We could, if it wasn't for Joanne. We're making 20 miles a day. We could make 30. "If we could beat them to it," exclaimed Aldous, clenching his hands. "If we only could, Donald. The rest would be easy." MacDonald laid a heavy hand on his knee. "You remember what you told me, Johnny? That you'd play the game fair and give 'em a first chance? You ain't figuring on that now, be ya?" "No. I'm with you now, Donald. It's shoot on sight." "Yes." Aldous rose from his seat as he spoke. "You turn in, Mac," he said. "You're about bushed after the work you've done today. I'll keep first watch. I'll conceal myself 50 or 60 yards from the camp, and if we have visitors before midnight, the fun will be all mine." He knew that MacDonald was asleep within 15 minutes after he stationed himself at his post. In spite of the fact that he had almost no sleep the preceding night, he was more than usually wakeful. He was filled with a curious feeling that events were impending. Yet the hours passed. The moon flooded the valley again. The horses grazed without alarm, and nothing happened. He had planned not to awaken old Donald at midnight, but MacDonald rose himself, and came to take his place a little before 12. From that hour until 4 Aldous slept like the dead. He was tremendously refreshed when he awoke to find that the candle was alight in Joanne's tepee, and that MacDonald had built a fire. He waited for Joanne, and went with her to the tiny creek near the camp, where both bathed their faces in the snow-cold water from the mountain tops. Joanne had slept soundly for 8 hours, and she was fresh and happy as a bird. Her lameness was almost gone, and she was eager for the day's journey. As they filed again up the valley that morning, with the early sun transfiguring the great snow-topped ranges about them into a paradise of color and warmth, Aldous found himself mentally wondering if it were really possible that a serious danger menaced them. He did not tell MacDonald what was in his mind. He did not confess that he was about ready to believe that the one man on the snow ridge had been a hunter or prospector returning to his camp in the other valley, and that the attack in Tête Jaune was the one and only effort Quade would make to secure possession of Joanne. Well, a few hours before he had almost expected an immediate attack. He was now becoming more and more convinced that Quade, to a large extent, had dropped out of the situation. He might be with Mortimer Fitzhugh, and probably was, a dangerous and formidable enemy to be accounted for when the final settlement came. But as to an immediate menace to Joanne, Aldous was beginning to fear him less as the hours passed. Joanne and the day itself were sufficient to disarm him of his former apprehension, and Joanne, each time that he looked at her, was a greater joy to him. Constantly she was pointing out the wonders of the mountains to him and MacDonald. Each new rise or fall in the valley held fresh and delightful surprises for her. In the craggy peaks she pointed out castlements and towers, and battlemented strongholds of ancient princes and kings. Her mind was a wild and beautiful riot of imagination and wonder and of happiness, and in spite of the grimness of the mission they were on, even MacDonald found himself rejoicing in her spirit, and he laughed and talked with them as they rode into the north. They were entering now into a hunter's paradise. For the first time Joanne saw white moving dots far up on a mountainside, which MacDonald told her were goats. In the afternoon they saw mountain sheep feeding on a slide half a mile away, and for 10 breathless minutes Joanne watched them through the telescope. Twice caribou sped over the opens ahead of them, but it was not until the sun was settling toward the west again that Joanne saw what she had been vainly searching the sides of the mountains to find. MacDonald had stopped suddenly in the trail, motioning them to advance. When they rode up to him, he pointed to a green slope 200 yards ahead. "There's your grizzly, Joanne," he said. A huge, tawny beast was ambling slowly along the crest of the slope, and at the sight of him Joanne gave a little cry of excitement. "He's hunting for gophers," explained MacDonald. "That's why he don't seem in a hurry. He don't see us because the bar's eyes are nearsighted, but he could smell us half a mile away if the wind was right." He was unslinging his long rifle as he spoke. Joanne was near enough to catch his arm. "Don't shoot! Please don't shoot!" she begged. "I've seen lions, and I've seen tigers, and they're treacherous, and I don't like them. But there's something about bears that I love, like dogs. And the lion isn't a king among beasts compared to him. Please don't shoot." "I ain't a-goin' to," chuckled old Donald. "I'm just getting ready to give him the proper sort of a handshake if he should happen to come this way, Joanne. You know, a grizzly ain't particular afraid of anything on earth as I know of, and they're worse'n dynamite explosion when they come head on. There, he's going over the slope." "Got our wind?" said Aldous. They went on, a color in Joanne's face like a vivid sunset. They camped 2 hours before dusk, and MacDonald figured they made better than 20 miles that day. The same precautions were observed in guarding the camp as the night before, and the long hours of vigil were equally uneventful. The next day added still more to Aldous' peace of mind regarding the possible attack from Quade, and on the night of this day, their 4th in the mountains, he spoke his mind to MacDonald. For a few minutes afterward the old hunter smoked quietly at his pipe, and then he said, "I don't know, but you're right, Johnny. If they were behind us, they'd most likely have tried something before this. But it ain't in the law of the mountains to be careless. We got to watch." "I agree with you there, Mac," replied Aldous. "We cannot afford to lose our caution for a minute, but I'm feeling a deuced sight better over the situation just the same. If we can get there ahead of them—" "If Quade is in the bunch we've got a chance of beating them," said MacDonald thoughtfully. "He's heavy, Johnny. That sort of heaviness don't stand up well in the mountains. Whiskey flesh, I call it. Culver Rann don't weigh much more'n half as much, but he's like iron. Quade may be a drag. And Joanne, Lord bless her, she's facing the music like an hero, Johnny. And the journey is almost half over. This is the 4th day, and I figure we can make it in 10 at most, maybe 9, said old Donald. You see, we're in the part of the Rockies where there's real mountains, and the ranges ain't broke up much. We got a fairly good travel to the end. On this night Aldous slept from 8 until 12. The next, their 5th, his watch was from midnight until morning. As the 6th and 7th days and nights passed uneventfully, the belief that there were no enemies behind them became a certainty. Yet neither Aldous nor MacDonald relaxed their vigilance. The 8th day dawned, and now a new excitement took possession of Donald MacDonald. Joanne and Aldous saw his efforts to suppress it, but it did not escape their eyes. They were nearing the tragic scenes of long ago, and old Donald was about to reap the reward of a search that had gone faithfully and untiringly through the winters and summers of 40 years. He spoke seldom that day. There were strange lights in his eyes, and once his voice was husky and strained as he said to Aldous, "I guess we'll make it tomorrow, Johnny. Just about as the sun's going down." They camped early, and Aldous rolled himself in his blanket when Joanne extinguished the candle in her tent. He found that he could not sleep, and he relieved MacDonald at 11 o'clock. "Get all the rest you can, Mac," he urged. "There may be doin's tomorrow, at about sundown." There was but little moonlight now, and the stars were clear. He lighted his pipe, and with his rifle in the crook of his arm, he walked slowly up and down over 100-yard stretch of the narrow plain in which they had camped. That night they built their fire beside a fallen log, which was now a glowing mass without flame. Finally he sat down with his back to a rock 50 paces from Joanne's tepee. It was a splendid night. The air was cool and sweet. He leaned back until his head rested against the rock, and there fell upon him the fatal temptation to close his eyes and snatch a few minutes of slumber which had not come to him during the early hours of the night. He was in a doze, oblivious to movement and the softer sounds of the night, when a cry pierced the struggling consciousness of his brain like the sting of a dart. For an instant he was on his feet. In the red glow of the log stood Joanne in her long white night-robe. She seemed to be swaying when he first saw her. Her hands were clutched at her bosom, and she was staring out into the night beyond the burning log, and in her face was a look of terror. He sprang toward her, and out of the gloom beyond her rushed Donald MacDonald. With a cry she turned to Aldous and flung herself shivering and half sobbing into his arms. Grey-faced, his eyes burning like the smouldering coals in the fire, Donald MacDonald stood a step behind them, his long rifle in his hands. "What is it?" cried Aldous. "What has frightened you, Joanne?" She was shuddering at his breast. It must have been a dream," she said. "It frightened me, but it was so terrible, and I'm sorry, John. I didn't know what I was doing." "What was it, dear?" insisted Aldous. MacDonald had drawn very close. Joanne raised her head. "Please let me go back to bed, John. It was only a dream, and I'll tell you about it in the morning, when there's sunshine and day." Something in MacDonald's tense, listening attitude caught Aldous' eyes. "What was the dream?" he urged. She looked from him to old Donald and shivered. "The flap of my tepee was open," she said slowly. "I thought I was awake. I thought I could see the glow of the fire. But it was a dream. A dream! Only it was horrible. For as I looked I saw the face out there in the light, a white, searching face. And it was his face." "Whose face?" "Mortimer Fitzhugh's." She shuddered. Tenderly Aldous led her back to the tent. "Yes, it surely was an unpleasant dream, dear," he comforted her. "Try and sleep again. You must get all the rest you can." He closed the flap after her and turned back toward MacDonald. The old hunter had disappeared. It was 10 minutes before he came in from out of the darkness. He went straight to Aldous. "Johnny, you was asleep?" "I'm afraid I was, Mac. Just for a minute." MacDonald's fingers gripped his arm. "Just for a minute, Johnny, and in that minute you lost the chance of your life." "What do you mean?" "I mean," the old Donald's voice was filled with a low, choking tremble that Aldous had never heard in it before, "I mean that it weren't no dream, Johnny. Mortimer Fitzhugh was in this camp tonight." End of 24. Recording by Joanne Rochon.
Chapter 25 of The Hunted Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Hunted Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 25. Donald MacDonald's startling assertion that Mortimer FitzHugh had been in the camp, and that Joanne's dream was not a dream, but reality, brought a gasp of astonishment and disbelief from Aldous. Before he had recovered sufficiently from his amazement to speak, MacDonald was answering the question in his mind. "I woke quicker than you, Johnny," he said. "She was just coming out of the tepee, and I heard something running off through the brush. I thought mebbe it was a wolverine or a bear, and I didn't move until she cried out your name, and you jumped up. If she had seen a bear in the fire glow, she wouldn't have thought it was Mortimer FitzHugh, would she? It's possible, but it ain't likely, though I do say it's mighty queer why he should be in this camp alone. It's up to us to watch pretty close until daylight. He wouldn't be here alone," asserted Aldous. "Let's get out of the light, Mac. If you're right, the whole gang isn't far away." "They ain't in rifle shot," said MacDonald. "I heard him running 100 yards out there. That's the queer thing about it. Why didn't they jump on us when they had the chance?" "We'll hope that was a dream," replied Aldous. "If Joanne was dreaming of FitzHugh, and while still half asleep saw something in camp, she might easily imagine the rest. But we'll keep watch. Shall I move out there?" MacDonald nodded, and the two men separated. For 2 hours they patrolled the darkness, waiting and listening. With dawn Aldous returned to camp to arouse Joanne and begin breakfast. He was anxious to see what effect the incident of the night had on her. Her appearance reassured him. When he returned to the dream, and the manner in which she had come out into the night, a lovely confusion sent the blushes into her face. He kissed her until they grew deeper, and she hid her face on his neck. And then she whispered something, with her face still against his shoulder, that drove the hot blood into his own cheeks. "You are my husband, John, and I don't suppose I should be ashamed to let you see me in my bare feet, but, John, you have made me feel that way, and I am your wife." He held her head close against him, so that she could not see his face. "I wanted to show you that I loved you that much," he said, scarcely knowing what words he was speaking. "Joanne, my darling—" A soft hand closed his lips. "I know, John," she interrupted him softly, "and I love you so for it. And I am so proud of you, oh, so proud, John." He was glad that MacDonald came crashing through the bush then. Joanne slipped from his arms and ran into the tepee. In MacDonald's face was a grim and sullen look. "You missed your chance, all right, Johnny," he growled. "I found where a horse was tied out there. The tracks lead to a big slide of rock that opens a break in the west range. Whoever it was has beat it back into the other valley. I can't understand, so help me God. I can't, Johnny. Why should FitzHugh come over into this valley alone? And he rode away. I'd say the devil couldn't do that." He said nothing more, but went out to lead in the hobbled horses, leaving Aldous in half-stunned wonderment to finish the preparation of breakfast. Joanne appeared a little later and helped him. It was 6 o'clock before breakfast was over, and they were ready to begin their day's journey. As they were throwing the hitch over the last pack, MacDonald said in a low voice to Aldous, "Everything may happen today, Johnny. I figure we'll reach the end by sundown, and what don't happen there may happen along the trail. Keep a rifle shot behind with Joanne. If there's nothing unexpected shooting, we want what you might call a reserve force in the rear. I figure I can see danger, if there is any, and I can do it best alone." Aldous knew that in these last hours Donald MacDonald's judgment must be final, and he made no objection to an arrangement which seemed to place the old hunter under a more hazardous risk than his own. And he realized fully that these were the last hours. For the first time he had seen MacDonald fill his pockets with the finger-long cartridges for his rifle, and he had noted how carefully he had looked at the breech of that rifle. Without questioning, he had followed the mountaineer's example. There were 50 spare cartridges in his own pockets. His .303 was freshly cleaned and oiled. He had tested the mechanism of his automatic. MacDonald had watched him, and both understood what such preparations meant as they set out on this last day's journey into the north. They had not kept from Joanne the fact that they would reach the end before night, and as they rode the prescribed distance behind the old hunter, Aldous wondered how much she guessed and what she knew. They had given her to understand that they were beating out the rival party, but he believed that in spite of all their efforts there was in Joanne's mind a comprehension which she did not reveal in voice or look. Today she was no different than yesterday or the day before, except that her cheeks were not so deeply flushed, and there was an uneasy questing in her eyes. He believed that she sensed the nearness of tragedy, that she was conscious of what they were now trying to hide from her, and that she did not speak because she knew that he and MacDonald did not want her to know. His heart throbbed with pride. Her courage inspired him, and he noticed that she rode closer to him, always at his side through that day. Early in the afternoon MacDonald stopped on the crest of a swell in the valley, and waited for them. When he came up he was facing the north. He did not look at them. For a few moments he did not speak. His hat was pulled low, and his beard was twitching. They looked ahead. At their feet the valley broadened until it was a mile in width. Half a mile away a band of caribou were running for the cover of a park-like clump of timber. MacDonald did not seem to notice them. He was still looking steadily, and he was gazing at a mountain. It was a tremendous mountain, a terrible-looking, ugly mountain, perhaps 3 miles away. Aldous had never seen another like it. Its 2 huge shoulders were of almost ebon blackness, and glistened in the sunlight as if smeared with oil. Between those 2 shoulders rose a cathedral-like spire of rock and snow that seemed to tip the white fleece of the clouds. MacDonald did not turn when he spoke. His voice was deep and vibrant with an intense emotion, yet he was not excited. "I've been hunting for that mountain for 40 years, Johnny." "Mac!" Aldous leaned over and laid a hand on the old mountaineer's shoulder. Still MacDonald did not look at him. 40 years," he repeated, as if speaking to himself. "I see how I missed it now. Just as DeBar said, I hunted from the west, and on that side the mountain ain't black. We must have crossed this valley and come in from the east 40 years ago, Johnny." He turned now, and what Joanne and Aldous saw in his face was not grief. It was not the sorrow of one drawing near to his beloved dead, but a joy that had transfigured him. The fire and strength of the youth in which he had first looked upon this valley, with Jane at his side, burned again in the sunken eyes of Donald MacDonald. After 40 years he had come into his own. Somewhere very near was the cavern with the soft white floor of sand, and for a moment Aldous fancied that he could hear the beating of MacDonald's heart, while from Joanne's tender bosom there rose a deep, sobbing breath of understanding. And MacDonald, facing the mountain again, pointed with a long, gaunt arm and said, "We're almost there, Johnny. God have mercy on them if they've beat us out." End of chapter 25. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Chapter 26 of The Hunted Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Hunted Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 26. They rode on into the Valley of Gold. Again MacDonald took the lead, and he rode straight into the face of the Black Mountain. Aldous no longer made an effort to keep Joanne in ignorance of what might be ahead of them. He put a 6th cartridge into the chamber of his rifle and carried the weapon across the pommel of his saddle. He explained to her now why they were riding behind, that if their enemies were laying in wait for them, MacDonald alone could make a swift retreat. Joanne asked no questions. Her lips were set tight. She was pale. At the end of 3/4 of an hour it seemed to them that MacDonald was riding directly into the face of a wall of rock. Then he swung sharply to the left and disappeared. When they came to the point where he had turned, they found that he had entered a concealed break in the mountain, a chasm with walls that rose almost perpendicular for 1,000 feet above their heads. A dark and solemn gloom pervaded this chasm, and Aldous drew nearer to MacDonald, his rifle held in readiness, and his bridle rein fastened to his saddle horn. The chasm was short. Sunlight burst upon them suddenly, and a few minutes later MacDonald waited for them again. Even Aldous could not restrain an exclamation of surprise when he rode up with Joanne. Under them was another valley, a wide sweeping valley between two rugged ranges that ran to the southwest. Up out of it there came to their ears a steady, rumbling roar. The air was filled with that roar. The earth seemed to tremble with it under their feet. And yet it was not loud. It came sullenly, as if from a great distance. And then they saw that MacDonald was not looking out over the sweep of the valley, but down. Half a mile under them there was a dip, a valley within a valley, and through it ran the silver sheen of a stream. MacDonald spoke no word now. He dismounted and leveled his long telescope at the little valley. Aldous helped Joanne from her horse, and they waited. A great breath came out at last from the old hunter. Slowly he turned. He did not give the telescope to Aldous, but to Joanne. She looked. For a full minute she seemed scarcely to breathe. Her hands trembled when she turned to give the glass to Aldous. "I see log cabins," she whispered. MacDonald placed a detaining hand on her arm. "Look again, Joanne," he said in a low voice that had in it a curious quiver. Again she raised the telescope to her eyes. "You see the little cabin nearest the river?" whispered Donald. "Yes, I see it." "That was our cabin, Jane's and mine, 40 years ago," he said, and now his voice was husky. Joanne's breath broke sobbingly as she gave Aldous the glass. Something seemed to choke him as he looked down upon the scene of the grim tragedy in which Donald MacDonald and Jane had played their fatal part. He saw the cabins as they had stood for nearly half a century. There were 4. 3 of them were small, and the 4th was large. They might have been built yesterday, for all that he could see of ruin or decay. The doors and windows of the larger cabin and 2 of the smaller ones were closed. The roofs were unbroken. The walls appeared solid. Twice he looked at the 4th cabin, with its wide-open door and window, and twice he looked at the cabin nearest the stream, where had lived Donald MacDonald and Jane. Donald had moved, and Joanne was watching him tensely when he took the glass from his eyes. Mutely the old mountaineer held out a hand, and Aldous gave him the telescope. Crouching behind a rock, he slowly swept the valley. For half an hour he looked through the glass, and in that time scarce a word was spoken. During the last 5 minutes of that half hour both Joanne and Aldous knew that MacDonald was looking at the little cabin nearest the stream, and with hands clasped tightly they waited in silence. At last old Donald rose, and his face and voice were filled with a wonderful calm. "There ain't been no change," he said softly. "I can see the log in front of the door that I used to cut kindling on. It was too tough for them to split and burn after we left. And I can see the tub I made out of spruce for Jane. It's leaning against the door, where I put it the day before we went away. 40 years ain't very long, Johnny. It ain't very long." Joanne had turned from them, and Aldous knew that she was crying. "And we've beat 'em to it, Johnny. We've beat 'em to it," exulted MacDonald. "There ain't a sign of life in the valley, and we sure could make it out from here if there was." He climbed into his saddle and started down the slope of the mountain. Aldous went to Joanne. She was sobbing. Her eyes were blinded by tears. "It's terrible, terrible," she whispered brokenly. "And it's beautiful, John. I feel as though I'd like to give my life to bring Jane back." "You must not betray tears or grief to Donald," said Aldous, drawing her close in his arms for a moment. Joanne, sweetheart, it is a wonderful thing that is happening with him. I dreaded this day. I have dreaded it for a long time. I thought that it would be terrible to witness the grief of a man with a heart like Donald's. But he is not filled with grief, Joanne. It is joy, a great happiness that perhaps neither you nor I can understand, that has come to him now. Don't you understand? He has found her. He has found their old home. Today is the culmination of 40 years of hope and faith and prayer. And it does not bring him sorrow, but gladness. We must rejoice with him. We must be happy with him. I love you, Joanne. I love you above all else on earth or in heaven. Without you I would not want to live. And yet, Joanne, I believe that I am no happier today than is Donald MacDonald." With a sudden cry, Joanne flung her arms about his neck. "John, is it that?" she cried, and joy shone through her tears. "Yes, yes, I understand now. His heart is not breaking. It is life returning into a heart that was empty. I understand. Oh, I understand now. And we must be happy with him. We must be happy when we find the cavern and Jane. And when we go down there to the little cabin that was their home. Yes, yes." They followed behind MacDonald. After a little spur of the mountainside shut out the little valley from them, and when they rounded this and they found themselves very near to the cabins, they rode down a beautiful slope into the basin. And when he reached the log buildings, old Donald stopped and dismounted. Again Aldous helped Joanne from her horse. Ahead of them MacDonald went to the cabin nearest the stream. At the door he paused and waited for them. 40 years, he said, facing them, and there ain't been so very much change as I can see. Years had dropped from his shoulders in these last few minutes, and even Aldous could not keep quite out of his face his amazement and wonder. Very gently Donald put his hand to the latch, as though fearing to awaken someone within, and very gently he pressed down on it, and put a bit of his strength against the door. It moved inward, and when it had opened sufficiently he leaned forward so that his head and half of his shoulders were inside. And he looked. A long time he looked, without a movement of his body or a breath that they could see. And then he turned to them again, and his eyes were shining as they had never seen them shine before. "I'll open the window," he said. "It's dark, dark inside." He went to the window, which was closed with a sapling barricade that had swung on hinges, and when he swung it back the rusted hinges gave way, and the thing crashed down at his feet. And now through the open window the sun poured in a warm radiance, and Donald entered the cabin with Joanne and Aldous close behind him. There was not much in the cabin, but what it held was earth and heaven and all else to Donald MacDonald. A strange glad cry surged from his chest as he looked about him. And now Joanne saw and understood what John Aldous had told her, for Donald MacDonald, after 40 years, had come back to his home. "Oh, my God, Johnny, they didn't touch anything. They didn't touch anything," he breathed in ecstasy. "I thought after we ran away they'd come in." He broke off, and his hat dropped from his hand, and he stood and stared. And what he was looking at, the sun fell upon in a great golden splash, and Joanne's hand gripped John's and held to it tightly. Against the wall, hanging as they had hung for 40 years, were a woman's garments, a hood, a shawl, a dress, and an apron that was half in tatters. And on the floor under these things were a pair of shoes. And as Donald MacDonald went to them, his arms reaching out, his lips moving, forgetful of all things but that he had come home, and Jane was here, Joanne drew Aldous softly to the door, and they went out into the day. Joanne did not speak, and Aldous did not urge her. He saw her white throat throbbing as if there were a little heart beating there, and her eyes were big and dark and velvety, like the eyes of a fawn that had been frightened. There was a thickness in his own throat, and he found that it was difficult for him to see far out over the plain. They waited near the horses. 50 yards from them ran the stream, a clear, beautiful stream which flowed in the direction from which the mysterious ramble of thunder seemed to come. This, Aldous knew, was the stream of gold. In the sand he saw wreckage which he knew were the ancient rockers. A shovel, thrust shaft deep, still remained where it had last been planted. Perhaps for 10 minutes Donald MacDonald remained in the cabin, then he came out. Very carefully he closed the door. His shoulders were thrown back, his head was held high. He looked like a monarch, and his voice was calm. "Everything is there, Johnny, everything but the gold," he said. "They took that." Now he spoke to Joanne. "You better not go with us into the other cabins," he said. "Why?" she asked softly. "Because there's death in them all." "I am going," she said. From the window of the largest cabin MacDonald pulled the sapling shutter, and, like the other, it fell at his feet. Then he opened the door and entered, and here the sunlight revealed the cabin's ghastly tragedy. The first thing that they saw, because it was most terrible, was a rough table, half over which lay the shrunken thing that had once been a man. A part of its clothes still remained, but the head had broken from its column, and the white and fleshless skull lay facing them. Out of tattered and dust-crumbling sleeves reached the naked bones of hands and arms, and on the floor lay another of these things in a crumpled and huddled heap. Only the back of the skull was showing, like the polished pate of a bald man. These things they saw first, and then two others. On the table were a heap of age-blackened and dusty sacks, and out of the back of the crumbling thing that guarded them stuck the long buckhorn hilt of a knife. "They must 'a' had died fighting," said MacDonald. "And there, Johnny, is their gold." White as death, Joanne stood in the door and watched them. MacDonald and Aldous went to the sacks. They were of buckskin. The years had not aged them. When Aldous took one in his hand he found that it was heavier than lead. With his knife MacDonald cut a slit in one of them, and the sun that came through the window flashed in a little golden stream that ran from the bag. "We'll take them out and put them in a pannier," said MacDonald. "The others won't be far behind us, Johnny." Between them they carried out the 7 sacks of gold. It was a load for their arms. They put it in one of the panniers, and then MacDonald nodded toward the cabin next the one that had been his own. "I wouldn't go in there, Joanne," he said. "I'm going," she whispered again. "It was their cabin, the man and his wife," persisted old Donald. "And the man was beasts, Joanne. I don't know what happened in there, but I guess." "I'm going," she said again. MacDonald pulled down the barricade from the window, a window that also faced the south and west, and this time he had to thrust against the door with his shoulder. They entered, and now a cry came from Joanne's lips, a cry that had in it horror, disbelief, a woman's wrath. Against the wall there was a pile of something, and on that pile was the searching first light of day that had fallen upon it for nearly half a century. The pile was a man crumpled down. Across it, her skeleton arms thrown about it protectingly, was a woman. This time Aldous did not go forward. MacDonald was alone, and Aldous took Joanne from the cabin and held her while she swayed in his arms. Donald came out a little later, and there was a curious look of exultation and triumph in his face. "She killed herself," he said. "That was her husband. I know him. I gave him the rock nails he put in the soles of his boots, and the nails are still there." He went alone into the remaining 2 cabins, while Aldous stood with Joanne. He did not stay long. From the 4th cabin he brought an armful of the little brown sacks. He returned and brought a second armful. "There's 3 more in that last cabin," he explained. 2 men and a woman. She must have been the wife of the man they killed. They were the last to live, and they starved to death. "And now, Johnny—" He paused, and he drew in a great breath. He was looking to the west, where the sun was beginning to sink behind the mountains. "And now, Johnny, if you're ready, and if Joanne is ready, we'll go," he said. End of chapter 26. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Chapter 27 of The Hunted Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Hunted Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 27. As they went up out of the basin into the broad meadows of the larger valley, MacDonald rode between Aldous and Joanne, and the pack horses, led by Pinto, trailed behind. Again old Donald said, as he searched the valley, "We've beat 'em, Johnny. Quade and Ron are coming up on the other side of the range, and I figure they're just about a day behind, maybe only hours, or an hour. You can't tell. There's more gold back there. We got about 100 pounds in them 15 sacks, and there was twice that much. It's hid somewhere. Calkins used to keep his'n under the floor. So did Watts. We'll find it later. And the river, and the dry gulches on both sides of the valley, they're full of it. It's all gold, Johnny. Gold everywhere." He pointed ahead to where the valley rose in a green slope between two mountains, half a mile away. "That's the break," he said. "It don't seem very far now, do it, Joanne?" His silence seemed to have dropped from him like a mantle, and there was joy in what he was telling. "But it was a distance that night, a tumble distance," he continued, before she could answer. "That was 41 years ago, coming November, and it was cold, and the snow was deep. It was bitter cold, so cold it caught my Jane's lungs, and that was what made her go a little later. The slope up there don't look steep now, but it was steep then, with 2 feet of snow to drag ourselves through. I don't think the cavern is more'n 5 or 6 miles away, Johnny, maybe less, and it took us 20 hours to reach it. It snowed so heavy that night, and the wind blowed so, that our trail was filled up, or they might 'a' followed." Many times Aldous had been on the point of asking old Donald a question. For the first time he asked it now, even as his eyes swept slowly and searchingly over the valley for signs of Mortimer FitzHugh and Quade. "I've often wondered why you ran away with Jane," he said. "I know what threatened her, a thing worse than death. But why did you run? Why didn't you stay and fight?" A low growl rumbled in MacDonald's beard. "Johnny, Johnny, if I only could," he groaned. "There was 5 of them left when I ran into the cabin and barricaded myself there with Jane. I stuck my gun out of the window, and they was afraid to rush the cabin. They was afraid, Johnny, all that afternoon, and I didn't have a cartridge left to fire. That's why we went just as soon as we could crawl out in the dark. I knew they'd come that night. I might 'a' killed 1 or 2 hand to hand, for I was big and strong in them days, Johnny, but I knew I couldn't beat 'em all. So we went." "After all, death isn't so very terrible," said Joanne softly, and she was riding so close that for a moment she laid one of her warm hands on Donald MacDonald's. "No, it's sometimes wonderful." "And beautiful," replied Donald, a little brokenly, and with that he rode ahead, and Joanne and Aldous waited until the pack horses had passed them. "He's going to see that all is clear at the summit," explained Aldous. They seemed to be riding now right into the face of that mysterious rumble and roar of the mountains. It was an hour before they all stood together at the top of the break, and here MacDonald swung sharply to the right, and came soon to the rock-strewn bed of a dried-up stream that in ages past had been a wide and rushing torrent. Steadily, as they progressed down this, the rumble and roar grew nearer. It seemed that it was almost under their feet, when again MacDonald turned, and a quarter of an hour later they found themselves at the edge of a small plain, and now all about them were cold and towering mountains that shut out the sun, and 100 yards to their right was a great dark cleft in the floor of the plain, and up out of this came the rumble and roar that was like the sullen anger of monster beasts imprisoned deep down in the bowels of the earth. MacDonald got off his horse, and Aldous and Joanne rode up to him. In the old man's face was a look of joy and triumph. "It weren't so far as I thought it was, Johnny," he cried. "Oh, it must have been a terrible night when Jane and I come this way. It took us 20 hours, Johnny." "We are near the cavern?" breathed Joanne. "It ain't more'n half a mile farther on, I guess. But we'll camp here. We're pretty well hid. They can't find us. And from that summit up there we can keep watch in both valleys." Knowing the thoughts that were in MacDonald's mind, and how full his heart was with a great desire, Aldous went to him when they had dismounted. "You go on alone if there is time tonight, Mac," he said, knowing that the other would understand him. "I will make camp." "There ain't no one in the valley," mused the old man, a little doubtfully at first. "It would be safe, quite safe, Johnny." "Yes, it will be safe, and I will stand guard while John is working," said Joanne, who had come to them. "No one can approach us without being seen." For another moment MacDonald hesitated. Then he said, "Do you see that break over there across the plain? It's the open to a gorge. Johnny, it do seem unreasonable. It do seem as though I must 'a' been dreamin' when I think that it took us 20 hours. But the snow was to my waist in this plain, and it was slow work, terrible slow work. I think the cavern ain't only a little way up that gorge. You can make it before the sun is quite gone. And I could hear you shout, or your gun. I could ride back in 5 minutes, and I wouldn't be gone an hour." "There is no danger," urged Aldous. A deep breath came from old Donald's breast. "I guess I'll go, Johnny, if you and Joanne don't mind." He looked about him, and then he pointed toward the face of a great rock. "Put the tepee up near that," he said. "Pile the saddles and the blankets and the panniers around it, so it'll look like a real camp, Johnny. But it won't be a real camp. It'll be a dummy. See them thick spruce and cedar over there? Build Joanne a shelter of boughs in there, and take in some grub and blankets and the gold. See the point, Johnny? If anything should happen—" "They'll tackle the bogus camp!" cried Aldous with elation. "It's a splendid idea." He set at once about unpacking the horses, and Joanne followed close at his side to help him. MacDonald mounted his horse and rode at a trot in the direction of the break in the mountain. The sun had disappeared, but its reflection was still on the peaks, and after he had stripped and hobbled the horses, Aldous took advantage of the last of the day to scrutinize the plain and the mountain slopes through the telescope. After that he found enough dry poles with which to set up the tepee, and about this he scattered the saddles and panniers, as MacDonald had suggested. Then he cleared a space in the thick spruce, and brought to it what was required for their hidden camp. It was almost dark when he completed the spruce and cedar lean-to for Joanne. He knew that tonight they must build no fire, not even for tea, and when they had laid out the materials for their cold supper, which consisted of beans, canned beef and tongue, peach marmalade, bread bannock, and pickles and cheese, he went with Joanne for water to a small creek they had crossed 100 yards away. In both his hands, ready for instant action, he carried his rifle. Joanne carried the pail. Her eyes were big and bright and searching in that thick-growing dusk of night. She walked very close to Aldous, and she said, "John, I know how careful you and Donald have been in this journey into the north. I know what you have feared. Culver Rann and Quade are after the gold, and they are near. But why does Donald talk as though we are surely going to be attacked by them, or are surely going to attack them? I don't understand it, John. If you don't care for the gold so much, as you told me once, and if we find Jane tomorrow or tonight, why do we remain to have trouble with Quade and Culver Rann? Tell me, John." He could not see her face fully in the gloom, and he was glad that she could not see his. "If we can get away without fighting, we will, Joanne," he lied, and he knew that she would have known that he was lying if it had not been for the darkness. "You won't fight over the gold?" she asked, pressing his arm. "Will you promise me that, John?" "Yes, I promise that. I swear it," he cried, and so forcefully that she gave a glad little laugh. "Then if they don't find us tomorrow, we'll go back home?" She trembled, and he knew that her heart was filled with a sudden lightness. "And I don't believe they will find us. They won't come beyond that terrible place. And the gold! Why should they, John? Why should they follow us, if we leave them everything? Oh!" She shuddered and whispered, "I wish we had not brought the gold, John. I wish we had left it behind." "What we have is worth $30,000 or $40,000, he said reassuringly, as he filled his pail with water and they began to return. "We can do a great deal of good with that. Endowments, for instance," he laughed. As he spoke they both stopped and listened. Plainly they heard the approaching thud of hoofs. MacDonald had been gone nearer 2 hours than one, and believing that it was him, Aldous gave the owl signal. The signal floated back to them softly. 5 minutes later MacDonald rode up and dismounted. Until he had taken the saddle off and had hobbled his horse, he did not speak. Neither Joanne nor Aldous asked the question that was in their hearts. But even in the darkness they felt something. It was as if not only the torrent rushing through the chasm, but MacDonald's heart as well, was charging the air with a strange and subdued excitement. And when MacDonald spoke, that which they had felt was in his voice. "You ain't seen or heard anything, Johnny?" "Nothing. And you, Donald?" In the darkness Joanne went to the old man, and her hand found one of his and clasped it tightly. And she found that Donald MacDonald's big hand was trembling in a strange and curious way, and she could feel him quivering. "You found Jane?" she whispered. "Yes, I found her, little Joanne." She did not let go of his hand until they entered the open space which Aldous had made in the spruce. Then she remembered what Aldous had said to her earlier in the day, and cheerfully she lighted the 2 candles they had set out, and forced Aldous down first upon the ground, and then MacDonald, and began to help them to beans and meat and bannock, while all the time her heart was crying out to know about the cavern and Jane. The candle glow told her a great deal, for in it Donald MacDonald's face was very calm, and filled with a great peace, despite the trembling she had felt. Her woman's sympathy told her that his heart was too full on this night for speech, and when he ate but little, she did not urge him to eat more. And when he rose and went silently and alone out into the darkness, she held Aldous back. And when, still a little later, she went into her nest for the night, she whispered softly to him, "I know that he found Jane as he wanted to find her, and he is happy. I think he has gone out there alone to cry." And for a time after that, as he sat in the gloom, John Aldous knew that Joanne was sobbing like a little child in the spruce and cedar shelter he had built for her. End of chapter 27. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Chapter 28 of The Hunted Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Hunted Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 28. If MacDonald slept at all that night, Aldous did not know it. The old mountaineer watched until a little after 12 in the deep shadow of a rock between the 2 camps. "I can't sleep," he protested, when Aldous urged him to take his rest. "I might take a little stroll up the plain, Johnny, but I can't sleep." The plain lay in a brilliant starlight at this hour. They could see the gleam of the snow peaks. The light was almost like the glow of the moon. "There'll be plenty of sleep after tomorrow," added MacDonald, and there was a finality in his voice and words which set the others' blood stirring. "You think they will show up tomorrow?" "Yes. This is the same valley the cabins are in, Johnny. That big mountain runs out and splits it, and it curves like a horseshoe. From that mountain we can see them, no matter which way they come. They'll go straight to the cabins. There's a deep little run under the slope. You didn't see it when we came out, but it'll take us within 100 yards of 'em. And at 100 yards—" He shrugged his shoulders suggestively in the starlight, and there was a smile on his face. "It seems almost like murder," shuddered Aldous. "But it ain't," replied MacDonald quickly. "It's self-defense. If we don't do it, Johnny, if we don't draw on them first, what happened there 40 years ago is going to happen again, with Joanne." 100 yards, breathed Aldous, his jaws setting hard. "And there are 5. "They'll go into the cabins," said MacDonald. "At some time there will be 2 or 3 outside, and we'll take them first. At the sound of the shots the others will run out, and it will be easy. You can't very well miss a man at 100 yards, Johnny." "No, I won't miss." MacDonald rose. "I'm going to take a little stroll, Johnny." For 2 hours after that Aldous was alone. He knew why Donald could not sleep, and where he had gone. And he pictured him sitting before the little old cabin in the starlit valley, communing with the spirit of Jane. And during those 2 hours he steeled himself for the last time to the thing that was going to happen when the day came. It was nearly 3 o'clock when MacDonald returned. It was 4 o'clock before he roused Joanne, and it was 5 o'clock when they had eaten their breakfast, and MacDonald prepared to leave for the mountain with his telescope. Aldous had observed Joanne talking to him for several minutes alone, and he had also observed that her eyes were very bright, and that there was an unusual eagerness in her manner of listening to what the old man was saying. The significance of this did not occur to him when she urged him to accompany MacDonald. "2 pairs of eyes are better than one, John," she said, "and I cannot possibly be in danger here. I can see you all the time, and you can see me, if I don't run away or hide." And she laughed a little, breathlessly. "There is no danger, is there, Donald?" The old hunter shook his head. "There's no danger, but you might be lonesome," he said. Joanne put her pretty mouth close to Aldous' ear. "I want to be alone for a little while, dear," she whispered, and there was that mystery in her voice which kept him from questioning her, and made him go with MacDonald. In 3/4 of an hour they had reached the spur of the mountain from which MacDonald had said they could see up the valley, and also the break through which they had come the preceding afternoon. The morning mist still hung low, but as these melted away under the sun mile after mile of a marvelous panorama spread out swiftly under them, and as the distance of their vision grew, the deeper became the disappointment in MacDonald's face. For half an hour after the mist had gone he neither spoke nor lowered the telescope from his eyes. A mile away Aldous saw 3 caribou crossing the valley. A little later, on a green slope, he discerned a moving hulk that he knew was a bear. He did not speak until old Donald lowered the glass. "I can see for 8 miles up the valley, and there ain't a soul in sight," said MacDonald in answer to his question. "I figured they'd be along about now, Johnny." A dozen times Aldous had looked back at the camp. Twice he had seen Joanne. He looked now through the telescope. She was nowhere in sight. A bit nervously he returned the telescope to MacDonald. "And I can't see Joanne," he said. MacDonald looked. For 5 minutes he leveled the glass steadily at the camp. Then he shifted it slowly westward, and a low exclamation broke from his lips as he lowered the glass and looked at Aldous. "Johnny, she's just goin' into the gorge. She was just disappearin' when I caught her." "Going into the gorge?" gasped Aldous, jumping to his feet. "Mac!" MacDonald rose and stood at his side. There was something reassuring in the rumbling laugh that came from deep in his chest. "She's beat us," he chuckled. "Bless her, she's beat us. I didn't guess why she was asking me all them questions. And I told her, Johnny. Told her just where the cavern was up there in the gorge, and how you wouldn't hardly miss it if you tried. And she asked me how long it would take to walk there, and I told her half an hour. And she's going to the cavern, Johnny." He was telescoping his long glass as he spoke, and while Aldous was still staring toward the gorge in wonderment and a little fear, he added, "We'd better follow. Quade and Ron can't get here inside of 2 or 3 hours, and we'll be back before then." Again he rumbled with that curious chuckling laugh. "She beat us, Johnny. She beat us fair. And she's got spirit, a wonderful spirit, to go up there alone." Aldous wanted to run, but he held himself down to MacDonald's stride. His heart trembled apprehensively as they hurriedly descended the mountain and cut across the plain. He could not quite bring himself to MacDonald's point of assurance regarding Quade and Mortimer FitzHugh. The old mountaineer was positive that the other party was behind them. Aldous asked himself if it were not possible that Quade and FitzHugh were ahead of them, and already waiting and watching for their opportunity. He had suggested that they might have swung farther to the west, with the plan of descending upon the valley from the north, and MacDonald had pointed out how unlikely this was. In spite of this, Aldous was not in a comfortable frame of mind as they hurried after Joanne. She had half an hour's start of them when they reached the mouth of the gorge, and not until they traveled another half hour up the rough bed of the break between the two mountains, and MacDonald pointed ahead and said, "There's the cavern," did he breathe easier. They could see the mouth of the cavern when they were yet a couple of 100 yards from it. It was a wide, low cleft in the north face of the chasm wall, and in front of it, spreading out like the flow of a stream, was a great spatter of white sand, like a huge rug that had been spread out in a space cleared of its chaotic litter of rock and broken slate. At first glance Aldous guessed that the cavern had once been the exit of a subterranean stream. The sand deadened the sound of their footsteps as they approached. At the mouth of the cave they paused. It was perhaps 40 or 50 feet deep, and as high as a 9-foot room. Inside it was quite light. Halfway to the back of it, upon her knees, and with her face turned from them, was Joanne. They were very close to her before she heard them. With a startled cry she sprang to her feet, and Aldous and MacDonald saw what she had been doing. Over a long mound in the white sand still rose the sapling stake which Donald had planted there 40 years before, and about this, and scattered over the grave, were dozens of wild asters and purple hyacinths, which Joanne had brought from the plain. Aldous did not speak, but he took her hand and looked down with her on the grave. And then something caught his eyes among the flowers, and Joanne drew him a step nearer, her eyes shining like velvet stars, while his heart beat faster when he saw what the object was. It was a book, open in the middle, and it lay face downward on the grave. It was old, and looked as though it might have fallen into dust at the touch of his finger. Joanne's voice was low and filled with a whispering awe. "It was her Bible, John." He turned a little, and noticed that Donald had gone to the mouth of the cavern and was looking toward the mountain. "It was her Bible," he heard Joanne repeating. And then MacDonald turned toward them, and he saw in his face a look that seemed strange and out of place in this home of the dead. He went to him, and Joanne followed. MacDonald had turned again, was listening, and holding his breath. Then he said, still with his face toward the mountain and the valley, "I may be mistaken, Johnny, but I think I heard a rifle shot." For a full minute they listened. "It seemed off there," said MacDonald, pointing to the south. "I guess we'd better get back to camp, Johnny." He started ahead of them, and Aldous followed as swiftly as he could with Joanne. She was panting with excitement, but she asked no questions. MacDonald began to spring more quickly from rock to rock. Over the level spaces he began to run. He reached the edge of the plain 400 or 500 yards in advance of them, and was scanning the valley through his telescope when they came up. "They're not on this side," he said. "They're coming up the other side of the valley, Johnny. We've got to get to the mountain before we can see them." He closed the glass with a snap and swung it over his shoulder. Then he pointed toward the camp. "Take Joanne down there," he commanded. "Watch the break we came through, and wait for me. I'm going up on the mountain and take a look." The last words came back over his shoulder as he started on a trot down the slope. Only once before had Aldous seen MacDonald employ greater haste, and that was on the night of the attack on Joanne. He was convinced there was no doubt in Donald's mind about the rifle shot, and that the shot could mean but one thing, the nearness of Mortimer FitzHugh and Quade. Why should they reveal their presence in that way he did not ask himself as he hurried down into the plain with Joanne. By the time they reached the camp old Donald had covered 2/3 of the distance to the mountain. Aldous looked at his watch, and a curious thrill shot through him. Only a little more than an hour had passed since they had left the mountain to follow Joanne, and in that time it would have been impossible for their enemies to have covered more than 1/3 of the 8-mile stretch of the valley which they had found empty of human life under the searching scrutiny of the telescope. He was right, and MacDonald was wrong. The sound of the shot, if there had been a shot, must have come from some other direction. He wanted to shout his warning to MacDonald, but already too great a distance separated them. Besides, if he was right, MacDonald would run into no danger in that direction. Their menace was to the north, beyond the chasm out of which came the rumble and roar of the stream. When Donald had disappeared up the slope, he looked more closely at the rugged walls of rock that shut them in on that side. He could see no break in them. His eyes followed the dark streak in the floor of the plain, which was the chasm. It was 200 yards below where they were standing, and 100 yards beyond the tepee he saw where it came out of a great rent in the mountain. He looked at Joanne. She had been watching him and was breathing quickly. "While Donald is taking his look from the mountain, I'm going to investigate the chasm," he said. She followed him a few steps behind. The roar grew in their ears as they advanced. After a little solid rock replaced the earth under their feet, and 20 paces from the precipice, Aldous took Joanne by the hand. They went to the edge and looked over. 50 feet below them the stream was caught in the narrow space between the two chasm walls, and above the rush and roar of it Aldous heard the startled cry that came from Joanne. She clutched his hand fiercely. Fascinated, she gazed down. The water, speeding like a mill race, was a lather of foam, and up through this foam there shot the crests of great rocks, as though huge monsters of some kind were at play, whipping the torrent into greater fury, and bellowing forth thunderous voices. Downstream Aldous could see that the tumult grew less. From the rent in the mountain came the deeper, more distant rolling thunder that they had heard on the other side of the range. And then, as he looked, a sharper cry broke from Joanne, and she dragged him back from the ledge and pointed toward the tepee. Out from the rocks had appeared a human figure. It was a woman. Her hair was streaming wildly about her, and in the sun it was black as a crow's wing. She rushed to the tepee, opened the flap, and looked in. Then she turned, and a cry that was almost a scream rang from her lips. In another moment she had seen Aldous and Joanne, and was running toward them. They advanced to meet her. Suddenly Aldous stopped, and with a sharp warning to Joanne he threw his rifle half to his shoulder, and faced the rocks from which the speeding figure had come. In that same instant they both recognized her. It was Marie, the woman who had ridden the bear at Tête Jaune, and with whom Mortimer FitzHugh had bought Joe DeBar. She staggered up to them, panting, exhausted, her breath coming in gulping sobs. For a moment she could not speak. Her dress was torn, her waist was ripped so that it exposed her throat and shoulders, and the front of the waist and her face were stained with blood. Her black eyes shone like a madwoman's. Fiercely she fought to get her breath, and all the time she clung to Joanne and looked at Aldous. She pointed toward the rocks, the chaotic upheaval that lay between the tepee and the chasm, and words broke gaspingly from her lips. "They're coming, coming!" she cried. "They killed Joe, murdered him, and they're coming to kill you!" She clutched a hand to her breast, and then pointed with it to the mountain where MacDonald had gone. "They saw him go, and they sent 2 men to kill him, and the rest are coming through the rocks." She turned sobbingly to Joanne. "They killed Joe," she moaned. "They killed Joe, and they're coming for you!" The emphasis on that final word struck like a blow in the ears of John Aldous. "Run for the spruce!" he commanded. "Joanne, run!" Marie had crumpled down in a moaning heap at Joanne's feet, and sat swaying with her face in her hands. "They killed him. They murdered my Joe," she was sobbing. "And it was my fault. My fault. I trapped him. I sold him. And, oh, my God, I loved him. I loved him." "Run, Joanne!" commanded Aldous a second time. "Run for the spruce." Instead of obeying him, Joanne knelt down beside Marie. He went to speak again, but there came an interruption, a thing that was like the cold touch of lead in his own heart. From up on the mountain, where the old mountaineer had walked into the face of death, there came a sharp, splitting report of a rifle. And in that same instant it was followed by another, and still a third, quick, stinging, whip-like reports, and he knew that not one of them had come from the gun of Donald MacDonald. And then he saw that the rocks behind the tepee had become suddenly alive with men. End of chapter 28. Recording by Dion Johns, Salt Lake City, Utah.
Chapter 29 of The Hunted Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock. The Hunted Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 29. Sheer amazement made Aldous hold his fire in that first moment. Marie had said that 2 men were after MacDonald. He had heard 3 shots nearly a mile away, and she was still sobbing that DeBar was dead. That accounted for 3. He had expected to see only Quade and Fitzhugh, and 1 other behind the tepee, and there were 6. He counted them as they came swiftly out from the shelter of the rocks to the level of the plain. He was about to fire when he thought of Joanne and Marie. They were still behind him, crouching upon the ground. To fire from where he stood would draw a fusillade of bullets in their direction, and with another warning cry to Joanne, he sped 20 paces to one side so that they would not be within range. Not until then did the attacking party see him. At 150 yards he had no time to pick out Quade or Mortimer FitzHugh. He fired first at a group of 3, and one of the 3 crumbled down as though his skull had been crushed from above. A rifle spat back at him, and the bullet sang like a rippling cloth close over his head. He dropped to his knees before he fired again, and a bullet clove the air where he had stood. The cracks of rifles did not hurry him. He knew that he had 6 cartridges, and only 6, and he aimed deliberately. At his second shot the man he had fired at ran forward 3 or 4 steps, and then pitched flat on his face. For a flash Aldous thought that it was Mortimer FitzHugh. Then, along his gun barrel, he saw FitzHugh, and pulled the trigger. It was a miss. 2 men had dropped upon their knees, and were aiming more carefully. He swung his sight to the foremost, and drove a bullet straight through his chest. The next moment something seemed to have fallen upon him with crushing weight. A red sea rose before his eyes. In it he was submerged. The roar of it filled his ears. It blinded him, and in the suffocating embrace of it he tried to cry out. He fought himself out of it. His eyes cleared, and he could see again. His rifle was no longer in his hands, and he was standing. 20 feet away men were rushing upon him. His brain recovered itself with the swiftness of lightning. A bullet had stunned him, but he was not badly hurt. He jerked out his automatic, but before he could raise it or even fire from his hip, the first of his assailants was upon him with a force that drove it from his hand. They went down together, and as they struggled on the bare rock, Aldous caught for a fraction of a second a scene that burned itself like fire in his brain. He saw Mortimer FitzHugh with a revolver in his hand. He had stopped. He was staring like one looking upon the ghost of the dead. And as he stared there rose above the rumbling roar of the chasm a wild and terrible shriek from Joanne. Aldous saw no more then. He was not fighting for his life, but for her, and he fought with the mad ferocity of a tiger. As he struck and choked and beat the head of his assailant on the rock, he heard shriek after shriek come from Joanne's lips, and then for a flash he saw them again, and Joanne was struggling in the arms of Quade. He struggled to his knees, and the man he was fighting struggled to his knees, and then they came to their feet, locked in a death grip on the edge of the chasm. From Quade's clutch he saw Joanne staring at Mortimer FitzHugh. Then her eyes shot to him, and with another shriek she fought to free herself. For 30 seconds of that terrible drama Mortimer FitzHugh stood as if hewn out of rock. Then he sprang towards the fighters. In the arms of John Aldous was the strength of 10 men. He twisted the head of his antagonist under his arm. He braced his feet. In another moment he would have flung him bodily into the roaring maelstrom below. Even as his muscles gathered themselves for the final effort, he knew that all was lost. Mortimer FitzHugh's face leered over his shoulder. His demoniac intention was in his eyes before he acted. With a cry of hatred and of triumph he shoved them both over the edge, and as Aldous plunged to the depths below, still holding to his enemy, he heard a last piercing scream from Joanne. As the rock slid away from under his feet, his first thought was that the end had come, and that no living creature could live in the roaring maelstrom of rock and flood into which he was plunging. But quicker than he dashed through the space, his mind worked. Instinctively, without time for reasoning, he gripped at the fact that his one chance lay in the close embrace of his enemy. He hung to him. It seemed to him that they turned over and over 100 times in that distance of 50 feet. Then a mass of twisting foam broke under him, and up out of it shot the head of one of the roaring monsters of rock that he and Joanne had looked upon. They struck it fairly, and Aldous was uppermost. He felt the terrific impact of the other's body. The foam boiled upward again, and they slipped off into the flood. Still Aldous held to his enemy. He could feel that he was limp now. He no longer felt the touch of the hands that had choked him, or the embrace of the arms that had struggled with him. He believed that his antagonist was dead. The 50-foot fall, with the rock splitting his back, had killed him. For a moment Aldous still clung to him as they sank together under the surface, torn and twisted by the whirling eddies and whirlpools. It seemed to him that they would never cease going down, that they were sinking a vast distance. Dully he felt the beat of rocks. Then it flashed upon him that the dead man was sinking like a weighted thing. He freed himself. Fiercely he struggled to bring himself to the surface. It seemed an eternity before he rose to the top. He opened his mouth and drew a great gulp of air into his lungs. The next instant the great rock reared like a living thing in his face. He plunged against it, was beaten over it, and again he was going down, down, in that deadly clutch of maelstrom and undertow. Again he fought, and again he came to the surface. He saw a black, slippery wall gliding past him with the speed of an express train, and now it seemed as though 1,000 clubs were beating him. Ahead of him were rocks, nothing but rocks. He shot through them like a piece of driftwood. The roaring in his ears grew less, and he felt the touch of something under his feet. Sunlight burst upon him. He caught at a rock and hung to it. His eyes cleared a little. He was within 10 feet of a shore covered with sand and gravel. The water was smooth and running with a musical ripple. Waist deep, he waded through it to the shore, and fell down upon his knees, with his face buried in his arms. He had been 10 minutes in the death grip of the chasm. It was another 10 minutes before he staggered to his feet and looked about him. His face was beaten until he was almost blind. His shirt had been torn from his shoulders, and his flesh was bleeding. He advanced a few steps. He raised one arm, and then the other. He limped. One arm hurt him when he moved it, but the bone was sound. He was terribly mauled, but he knew that no bones were broken, and a gasp of thankfulness fell from his lips. All this time his mind had been suffering even more than his body. Not for an instant, even as he fought for life between the chasm walls, and as he lay half unconscious on the rock, had he forgotten Joanne. His one thought was of her now. He had no weapon, but as he stumbled in the direction of the camp in the little plain, he picked up a club that lay in his path. That MacDonald was dead, Aldous was certain. There would be 4 against him. Quade and Mortimer FitzHugh and the 2 men who had gone to the mountain. His brain cleared swiftly as part of his strength returned, and it occurred to him that if he lost no time he might come upon Joanne and her captors before the two men came from killing old Donald. He tried to run. Not until then did he fully realize the condition he was in. Twice in the first 100 yards his legs doubled under him, and he fell down among the rocks. He grew steadily stronger, though each time he tried to run or spring a distance of a few feet his legs doubled under him like that. It took him 20 minutes to get back to the edge of the plain, and when he got there it was empty. There was no sign of Quade or Fitzhugh, or of Joanne and Marie, and there was no one coming from the direction of the mountain. He tried to run again, and he found that over the level floor of the valley he could make faster time than among the rocks. He went to where he had dropped his rifle. It was gone. He searched for his automatic. That, too, was gone. There was one weapon left, a long skinning knife in one of the panniers near the tepee. As he went for this, he passed two of the men whom he had shot. Quade and Fitzhugh had taken their weapons, and had turned them over to see if they were alive or dead. They were dead. He secured the knife, and behind the tepee he passed the third body, its face as still and white as the others. He shuddered as he recognized it. It was Slim Baker. His rifle was gone. More swiftly now he made his way into the break out of which his assailants had come a short time before. The thought came to him again that he had been right, and that Donald MacDonald, in spite of all his years in the mountains, had been fatally wrong. Their enemies had come down from the north, and this break led to their hiding place. Through it Joanne must have been taken by her captors. As he made his way over the rocks, gaining a little more of his strength with each step, his mind tried to picture the situation that had now arisen between Quade and Mortimer FitzHugh. How would Quade, who was mad for possession of Joanne, accept FitzHugh's claim of ownership? Would he believe his partner? Would he even believe Joanne if, to save herself from him, she told him FitzHugh was her husband? Even if he believed them, would he give her up? Would Quade allow Mortimer FitzHugh to stand between him and the object for which he was willing to sacrifice everything? As Aldous asked himself these questions, his blood ran hot and cold by turns, and the answer to them drew a deep breath of fear and of anguish from him as he tried again to run among the rocks. There could be but one answer. Quade would fight. He would fight like a madman, and if this fight had happened and FitzHugh had been killed, Joanne had already gone utterly and helplessly into his power. He believed that FitzHugh had not revealed to Quade his relationship to Joanne while they were on the plain, and the thought still more terrible came to him that he might not reveal it at all, that he might repudiate Joanne even as she begged upon her knees for him to save her. What a revenge it would be to see her helpless and broken in the arms of Quade. And then, both being beasts. He could think no farther. The sweat broke out on his face as he hobbled faster over a level space. The sound of the water between the chasm walls was now a thunder in his ears. He could not have heard a rifle shot or a scream 100 yards away. The trail he was following had continually grown narrower. It seemed to end a little ahead of him, and the fear that he had come the wrong way after all filled him with dread. He came to the face of the mountain wall, and then, to his left, he saw a crack that was no wider than a man's body. In it there was sand, and the sand was beaten by footprints. He wormed his way through, and a moment later stood at the edge of the chasm. 50 feet above him a natural bridge of rock spanned the huge cleft through which the stream was rushing. He crossed this, exposing himself openly to a shot if it was guarded. But it was not guarded. This fact convinced him that MacDonald had been killed, and that his enemies believed he was dead. If MacDonald had escaped, and they had feared a possible pursuit, someone would have watched the bridge. The trail was easy to follow now. Sand and grassy earth had replaced rock and shale. He could make out the imprints of feet, many of them, and they led in the direction of a piece of timber that apparently edged a valley running to the east and west. The rumble of the torrent in the chasm grew fainter as he advanced. A couple of 100 yards farther on the trail swung to the left again. It took him around the edge of a huge rock, and as he appeared from behind this, his knife clutched in his hand, he dropped suddenly flat on his face, and his heart rose like a lump in his throat. Scarcely 50 yards above him was the camp of his enemies. There were 2 teepees and piles of saddles and panniers and blankets about them, but not a soul that he could see. And then, suddenly, there rose a voice bellowing with rage, and he recognized it as Quade's. It came from beyond the tepee, and he rose quickly from where he had thrown himself and ran forward. With the tepee between him and those on the other side, close to the canvas, he dropped on his knees and crawled out behind a pile of saddles and panniers. From here he could see. So near that he could almost have touched them were Joanne and Marie, seated on the ground, with their backs toward him. Their hands were tied behind them, their feet were bound with pannier ropes. A dozen paces beyond them were Quade and Mortimer FitzHugh. The 2 men were facing each other, a yard apart. Mortimer FitzHugh's face was white, a deadly white, and he was smiling. His right hand rested carelessly in his hunting coat pocket. There was a sneering challenge on his lips. In his eyes was a look that Aldous knew meant death if Quade moved. And Quade was like a great red beast ready to spring. His eyes seemed bulging out on his cheeks. His great hands were knotted. His shoulders were hunched forward, and his mottled face was ablaze with passion. In that moment's dramatic tableau, Aldous glanced about swiftly. The men from the mountain had not returned. He was alone with Quade and Mortimer FitzHugh. Then FitzHugh spoke, very quietly, a little laughingly, but his voice trembled, and Aldous knew what the hand was doing in the hunting coat pocket. "You're excited, Billy," he said. "I'm not a liar, as you've very impolitely told me, and I'm not playing you dirt, and I haven't fallen in love with the lady myself, as you seem to think, but she belongs to me, body and soul. If you don't believe me, why, ask the lady herself, Billy." As he spoke he turned his sneering eyes for a fraction of a second towards Joanne. The movement was fatal. Quade was upon him. The hand in the coat pocket flung itself upward, then followed a muffled report, but the bullet flew wide. In all his life Aldous had never heard a sound like the roar that came from Quade's throat then. He saw Mortimer FitzHugh's hand appear with a pistol in it, and then the pistol was gone. He did not see where it went to. He gripped his knife and waited, his heart beating with what seemed like smouldered explosions as he watched for the opportunity which he knew would soon come. He expected to see FitzHugh go down under Quade's huge bulk. Instead of that, a small iron fist shot upward, and Quade's head went back as if broken from his neck. FitzHugh sprang a step backward, and in the movement his heel caught the edge of a pack saddle. He stumbled, almost fell, and before he could recover himself, Quade was at him again. This time there was something in the red brute's hand. It rose and fell once, and Mortimer FitzHugh reeled backward with a moaning cry, swayed for a second or two on his feet, and fell to the ground. Quade turned. In his hand was a bloody knife. Madness and passion and the triumphant joy of a demon were in his face as he glared at his helpless prey. As Aldous crouched lower, his shoulders touched one of the saddles. It slipped from the pile. One of the panniers followed it, and Quade saw him. There was no longer reason for concealment, and as Quade stood paralyzed for a moment, Aldous sprang forth into the space between him and Joanne. He heard the cry that broke strangely from her lips, but he did not turn his head. He advanced upon Quade, his head lowered, the long skinning knife gleaming in his hand. John Aldous knew that words would avail nothing in these last few minutes between him and Quade. The latter had already hunched himself forward, the red knife in his hand poised at his waistline. He was terrible, his huge bulk, his red face and bull neck, his eyes popping from behind their fleshy lids, and the dripping blade in the shapeless hull of his hand, gave him the appearance as he stood there of some monstrous gargoyle instead of a thing of flesh and blood. And Aldous was terrible to look at, but in a way that wrung a moaning cry from Joanne. His face was livid from the beat of the rocks. It was crusted with blood, his eyes were partly closed, and what remained of his shirt was drenched with blood that still ran from the deep cuts in his arms and shoulders. But it was he who advanced, and Quade who stood and waited. Aldous knew little or nothing of knife fighting, and he realized, also, that there was a strange weakness in his arms and body caused by his battle with the maelstroms in the chasm. But he had wrestled a great deal with the Indians of the north, who fought as their half-wolf sledge-dogs fought, and he employed their methods now. Slowly and deliberately he began to circle around Quade, so that Quade became the pivot of that circle, and as he circled he drew nearer and nearer to his enemy, but never in a frontal advance. He edged inward with his knife arm on the outside. His deadly deliberateness and the steady glare of his eyes discomfited Quade, who suddenly took a step backward. It was always when the Indians made this step that his opponent darted in, and Aldous, with this in mind, sprang to the attack. Their knives clashed in mid-air. As they met, hilt to hilt, Aldous threw his whole weight against Quade, darted sideways, and with a terrific lunge brought the blade of his knife down between Quade's shoulders. A straight blade would have gone from back to chest through muscle and sinew, but the knife which Aldous held scarcely pierced the other's clothes. Not until then did he fully realize the tremendous odds against him. The curved blade of his skinning knife would not penetrate. His one hope was to cut with it. He flung out his arm before Quade had fully recovered, and blind luck carried the keen edge of the knife across his enemy's pouchy cheek. The blood came in a spurt, and with a terrible cry Quade leaped back towards the pile of saddles and panniers. Before Aldous could follow his advantage the other had dropped his knife and had snatched up a 4-foot length of a tepee pole. For a moment he hesitated while the blood ran in a hot flood down his thick neck. Then with a bellow of rage he rushed upon Aldous. It was no time for knife work now. As the avalanche of brute strength descended upon him, Aldous gathered himself for the shock. He had already measured his own weakness. Those 10 minutes among the rocks of the chasm had broken and beaten him until his strength was gone. He was panting from his first onset with Quade, but his brain was working, and he knew that Quade was no longer a reasoning thing. He had ceased to think. He was blind with the passion of the brute, and his one thought was to crush his enemy down under the weight of the club in his huge hands. Aldous waited. He heard Joanne's terrified scream when Quade was almost upon him, when less than 5 feet separated them. The club was descending when he flung himself forward, straight for the other's feet. The club crashed over him, and with what strength he had gripped Quade at the knees. With a tremendous thud Quade came to earth. The club broke from the grip of his hands. For a moment he was stunned, and in that moment Aldous was at his throat. He would have sold the best of his life for the skinning knife, but he had lost it in gripping Quade, and now he choked. With every ounce of strength in him he choked at the thick red neck of his enemy. Quade's hands reached for his own throat. They found it, and both choked, lying there gasping and covered with blood, while Joanne struggled vainly to free herself, and scream after scream rang from her lips. And John Aldous knew that at last the end had come, for there was no longer strength in his arms, and there was something that was like a strange cramp in his fingers, while the clutch at his own throat was turning the world black. His grip relaxed. His hands fell limp. The last that he realized was that Quade was over him, and that he must be dying. Then it was, as he lay within a final second or two of death, no longer conscious of physical attack or of Joanne's terrible cries, that a strange and unforeseen thing occurred. Beyond the tepee a man had risen from the earth. He staggered toward them, and it was from Marie that the wildest and strangest cry of all came now. For the man was Joe DeBar. In his hand he held a knife. Swaying and stumbling he came to the fighters from behind. Quade did not see him, and over Quade's huge back he poised himself. The knife rose. For a fraction of a second it trembled in mid-air. Then it descended, and 8 inches of steel went to the heart of Quade. And as DeBar turned and staggered toward Joanne and Marie, John Aldous was sinking deeper and deeper into a black and abysmal night. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Hunted Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock. The Hunted Woman by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 30. In that chaotic night in which he was drifting, light as a feather floating on the wind, John Aldous experienced neither pain nor very much of the sense of life. And yet, without seeing or feeling, he seemed to be living. All was dead in him but that last consciousness, which is almost the spirit. He might have been dreaming, and minutes, hours, or even years might have passed in that dream. For a long time he seemed to be sinking through the blackness, and then something stopped him, without jar or shock, and he was rising. He could hear nothing. There was vast silence about him, a silence as deep and as unbroken as the abysmal pit in which he seemed to be softly floating. After a time Aldous felt himself swaying and rocking, as though tossed gently on the billows of a sea. This was the first thought that took shape in his struggling brain. He was at sea. He was on a ship in the heart of a black night, and he was alone. He tried to call out, but his tongue seemed gone. It seemed a very long time before day broke, and then it was a strange day. Little needles of light pricked his eyes. Silver strings shot like flashes of web like lightning through the darkness. And after that he saw for an instant a strange glare. It was gone in one big, powerful flash, and he was in night again. These days and nights seemed to follow one another swiftly now, and the nights grew less dark, and the days brighter. He was conscious of sounds and buffetings, and it was very hot. Out of this heat there came a cool, soft breeze that was continually caressing his face and eyes and head. It was like the touch of a spirit hand. It became more and more real to him. It caressed him into a dark and comfortable oblivion. Out of this oblivion a still brighter day roused him. His brain seemed clear. He opened his eyes. A white cloud was hovering over them. It fell softly. It was cool and gentle. Then it rose again, and it was not a cloud, but a hand. The hand moved away, and he was looking into a pair of wide-open, staring, prayerful eyes, and a little cry came to him, and a voice, "John, John!" He was drifting again, but now he knew that he was alive. He heard movement. He heard voices. They were growing nearer and more distinct. He tried to cry out Joanne's name, and it came in a whispering breath between his lips. But Joanne heard, and he heard her calling to him. He felt her hands. She was imploring him to open his eyes, to speak to her. It seemed many minutes before he could do this, but at last he succeeded, and this time his vision was not so blurred. He could see plainly. Joanne was there, hovering over him, and just beyond her was the great bearded face of Donald MacDonald. And then, before words had formed on his lips, he did a wonderful thing. He smiled. "Oh, my God, I thank thee," he heard Joanne cry out, and then she was on her knees, and her face was against his, and she was sobbing. He knew that it was MacDonald who drew her away. The great head bent over him. "Take this, will ye, Johnny boy?" Aldous stared. "Mac, you're alive," he breathed. "Alive as ever, Johnny. Take this." He swallowed. And then Joanne hovered over him again, and he put up his hands to her face, and her glorious eyes were swimming seas as she kissed him and choked back the sobs in her throat. He buried his fingers in her hair. He held her head close to him, and for many minutes no one spoke, while MacDonald stood and looked down on them. In those minutes everything returned to him. The fight was over. MacDonald had come in time to save him from Quade. And now his eyes stared upward through the sheen of Joanne's hair. He was in a cabin. He recognized it. It was Donald MacDonald's old home. When Joanne raised her head, he looked about him without speaking. He was in the wide bunk built against the wall. Sunlight was filtering through a white curtain at the window, and in the open door he saw the anxious face of Marie. He tried to lift himself, and was amazed to find that he could not. Very gently Joanne urged him back on his pillow. Her face was a glory of life and of joy. He obeyed her as he would have obeyed the hand of the Madonna. She saw all his questioning. "You must be quiet, John," she said, and never had he heard in her voice the sweetness of love that was in it now. "We will tell you everything, Donald and I, but you must be quiet. You were terribly beaten among the rocks. We brought you here at noon, and the sun is setting, and until now you have not opened your eyes. Everything is well, but you must be quiet. You were terribly bruised by the rocks, dear." It was sweet to lie under the caresses of her hand. He drew her face down to him. "Joanne, my darling, you understand now why I wanted to come alone into the north." Her lips pressed warm and soft against his. "I know," she whispered, and he could feel her arms trembling and her breath coming quickly. Gently she drew away from him. "I am going to make you some broth," she said then. He watched her as she went out of the cabin, one white hand lifted to her throat. Old Donald MacDonald seated himself on the edge of the bunk. He looked down at Aldous, chuckling in his beard, and Aldous, with his bruised and swollen face and half-opened eyes, grinned like a happy fiend. "It was a wonderful, wonderful fight, Johnny," said old Donald. "It was, Mac, and you came in fine on the home stretch." "What do you mean, home stretch?" queried Donald, leaning over. "You saved me from Quade." Donald fairly groaned. "I didn't, Johnny. I didn't. De Bear killed him. It was all over when I come. Only, Johnny, I had most curious word with Culver Wren afore he died." In his eagerness, Aldous was again trying to sit up when Joanne appeared in the doorway. With a little cry she darted out to him, forced him gently back, and brushed old Donald off the edge of the bunk. "Go out and watch the broth, Donald," she commanded firmly. Then she said to Aldous, stroking back his hair, "I forbade you to talk, John, dear. Aren't you going to mind me?" "Did Quade get me with the knife?" he asked. "No, no." "Am I shot?" "No, dear." "Any bones broken?" "Donald says not." "Then please give me my pipe, Joanne, and let me get up." "Why do you want me to lie here when I'm strong like an ox, as Donald says?" Joanne laughed happily. "You are getting better every minute," she cried joyously. "But you were terribly beaten by the rocks, John. If you will wait until you have the broth, I will let you sit up." A few minutes later, when he had swallowed his broth, Joanne kept her promise. Only then did he realize that there was not a bone or a muscle in his body that did not have its own particular ache. He grimaced when Joanne and Donald bolstered him up with pillows at his back. But he was happy. Twilight was coming swiftly, and as Joanne gave the final pats and turns to the blankets and pillows, MacDonald was lighting half a dozen candles placed around the room. "Any watch tonight, Donald?" asked Aldous. "No, Johnny, there ain't no watch tonight," replied the old mountaineer. He came and seated himself on a bench with Joanne. For half an hour after that Aldous listened to a recital of the strange things that had happened. How poor marksmanship had saved MacDonald on the mountainside, and how at last the duel had ended with the old hunter killing those who had come to slay him. When they came to speak of DeBar, Joanne leaned nearer to Aldous. "It is wonderful what love will sometimes do," she spoke softly. "In the last few hours Marie has bared her soul to me, John. What she has been she has not tried to hide from me, nor even from the man she loves. She was one of Mortimer FitzHugh's tools. DeBar saw her and loved her, and she sold himself to him in exchange for the secret of the gold. When they came into the north, the wonderful thing happened. She loved DeBar, not in the way of her kind, but as a woman in whom had been born a new heart, and a new soul and a new joy. She defied FitzHugh. She told DeBar how she had tricked him. This morning FitzHugh attempted his old familiarity with her, and DeBar struck him down. The act gave them excuse for what they had planned to do. Before her eyes, Marie thought they had killed the man she loved. She flung herself on his breast, and she said she could not feel his heart beat, and his blood flowed warm against her hands and face. Both she and DeBar had determined to warn us if they could. Only a few minutes before DeBar was stabbed he had let off his rifle. An accident, he said, but it was not an accident. It was the shot Donald heard in the cavern. It saved us, John, and Marie, waiting her opportunity, fled to us in the plain. DeBar was not killed. He says my screams brought him back to life. He came out and killed Quade with a knife. Then he fell at our feet. A few minutes later Donald came. DeBar is in another cabin. He is not fatally hurt, and Marie is happy." She was stroking his hand when she finished. The curious rumbling came softly in MacDonald's beard, and his eyes were bright with a whimsical humor. "I pretty near bored a hole through poor Joe when I come up," he chuckled. "But you bet I hugged him when I found what he'd done, Johnny. Joe says their camp was just over the range from us that night Fitzhugh looked us up." And Joanne thought she'd been dreaming. He didn't have any help, but his intention was to finish us alone, murder us asleep, when Joanne cried out. "Joe says it was just a devil's freak that took him to the top of the mountain alone that night. He saw our fire and came down to investigate." A low voice was calling outside the door. It was Marie. As Joanne went to her, a quick gleam came into old Donald's eyes. He looked behind him cautiously to see that she had disappeared. Then he bent over Aldous and whispered hoarsely: "Johnny, I had a most curious word with Rand, or Fitzhugh, afore he died. He wasn't dead when I went to him, but he knew he was dying. And Johnny, he was smiling and cool to the end. I wanted to ask him a question, Johnny. I was dead curious to know why the grave was empty. But he asked for Joanne, and I couldn't break in on his last breath. I brought her. The first thing he asked her was how people had took it when they found out he'd poisoned his father. When Joanne told him no one had ever thought he'd killed his father, Fitzhugh sat leaning against the saddles for a minute, so white and still I thought he had died with his eyes open. Then it came out, Johnny. He was smiling as he told it. He killed his father with poison to get his money. Later he came to America. He didn't have time to tell us how he come to think they'd discovered his crime. He was dying as he talked. He came out sort of slobberingly, Johnny. He thought they found him out. He changed his name and sent out the report that Mortimer Fitzhugh had died in the mountains. But, Johnny, he died afore I could ask him about the grave." There was a final note of disappointment in old Donald's voice that was almost pathetic. "It was such a curious grave," he said, "and the clothes were laid out so prim and nice." Aldous laid his hand on MacDonald's. "It's easy, Mac," he said, and he wanted to laugh at the disappointment that was still in the other's face. "Don't you see? He never expected anyone to dig into the grave, and he put the clothes and the watch and the ring in there to get rid of them. They might have revealed his identity. Why, Donald!" Joanne was coming to them again. She laid a cool hand on his forehead and held up a warning finger to MacDonald. "Hush," she said gently. "Your head is very hot, dear, and there must be no more talking. You must lie down and sleep. Tell John good night, Donald." Like a boy, MacDonald did as she told him, and disappeared through the cabin door. Joanne levelled the pillows and lowered John's head. "I can't sleep, Joanne," he protested. "I will sit here close at your side and stroke your face and hair," she said gently. "And you will talk to me?" "No, I must not talk. But, John." "Yes, dear." "If you will promise to be very, very quiet, and let me be very quiet." "Yes." "I will make you a pillow of my hair." "I will be quiet," he whispered. She unbound her hair and leaned over so that it fell into a flood on his pillow. With a sigh of contentment he buried his face in the rich, sweet masses of it. Gently, like the cooling breeze that had come to him in his hours of darkness, her hand caressed him. He closed his eyes. He drank in the intoxicating perfume of her tresses, and after a little he slept. For many hours Joanne sat at his bedside, sleepless and rejoicing. When Aldous awoke it was dawn in the cabin. Joanne was gone. For a few minutes he continued to lie with his face toward the window. He knew that he had slept a long time, and that the day was breaking. Slowly he raised himself. The terrible ache in his body was gone. He was still lame, but no longer helpless. He drew himself cautiously to the edge of the bunk and sat there for a time, testing himself before he got up. He was delighted at the result of the experiments. He rose to his feet. His clothes were hanging against the wall, and he dressed himself. Then he opened the door and walked out into the morning, limping a little as he went. MacDonald was up. Joanne's tepee was close to the cabin. The two men greeted each other quietly, and they talked in low voices, but Joanne heard them, and a few moments later she ran out with her hair streaming about her, and went straight into the arms of John Aldous. This was the beginning of the 3 wonderful days that yet remained for Joanne and John Aldous in Donald MacDonald's little valley of gold and sunshine and blue skies. They were strange and beautiful days, filled with a great peace and a great happiness, and in them wonderful changes were at work. On the second day Joanne and Marie rode alone to the cavern where Jane lay, and when they returned in the golden sun of the afternoon they were leading their horses and walking hand in hand. And when they came down to where DeBar and Aldous and Donald MacDonald were testing the richness of the black sand along the stream, there was a light in Marie's eyes and a radiance in Joanne's face which told again that world-old story of a Mary Magdalene and the dawn of another day. And now, Aldous thought, Marie had become beautiful, and Joanne laughed softly and happily that night, and confided many things into the ears of Aldous, while Marie and DeBar talked for a long time alone out under the stars, and came back at last hand in hand, like 2 children. Before they went to bed, Marie whispered something to Joanne, and a little later Joanne whispered it to Aldous. "They want to know if they can be married with us, John," she said. "That is, if you haven't grown tired of trying to marry me, dear," she added with a happy laugh. "Have you?" His answer satisfied her, and when she told a small part of it to Marie, the other woman's dark eyes grew as soft as the night, and she whispered the words to Joe. The third and the last day was the most beautiful of all. Joe's knife wound was not bad. He had suffered most from a blow on the head. Both he and Aldous were in condition to travel, and plans were made to begin the homeward journey on the 4th morning. MacDonald had unearthed another dozen sacks of hidden gold, and he explained to Aldous what must be done to secure legal possession of the little valley. His manner of doing this was unnatural and strained. His voice came haltingly. There was unhappiness in his eyes. It was in his voice. It was in the odd droop of his shoulders. And finally, when they were alone, he said to Aldous, with almost a sob in his voice, "Johnny, Johnny, if only the gold were not here!" He turned his eyes to the mountain, and Aldous took one of his big gnarled hands in both his own. "Say it, Mac," he said gently. "I guess I know what it is." "It ain't fair to you, Johnny," said old Donald, still with his eyes on the mountains. "It ain't fair to you. But when you take out the claims down there, it'll start a rush. You know what it means, Johnny. There'll be 1,000 men up here, and maybe you can't understand. But there's the cavern and Jane and the little cabin here, and it seems like desecrating her." His voice choked, and as Aldous gripped the big hand harder in his own, he laughed. "It would, Mac," he said. "I've been watching you while we made the plans. These cabins and the gold have been here for more than 40 years without discovery, Donald, and they won't be discovered again so long as Joe DeBar and John Aldous and Donald MacDonald have a word to say about it. We'll take out no claims, Mac. The valley isn't ours. It's Jane's valley and yours." Joanne, coming up just then, wondered what the 2 men had been saying that they stood as they did, with hands clasped. Aldous told her, and then old Donald confessed to them what was in his mind and what he had kept from them. At last he had found his home, and he was not going to leave it again. He was going to stay with Jane. He was going to bring her from the cavern and bury her near the cabin, and he pointed out the spot, covered with wild hyacinths and asters, where she used to sit on the edge of the stream and watch him while he worked for gold. And they could return each year and dig for gold, and he would dig for gold while they were away, and they could have it all. All that he wanted was enough to eat, and Jane, and the little valley. And Joanne turned from him as he talked, her face streaming with tears, and in John's throat was a great lump, and he looked away from MacDonald to the mountains. So it came to pass that on the fourth morning, when they went into the south, they stopped on the last knoll that shut out the little valley from the larger valley, and looked back, and Donald MacDonald stood alone in front of the cabin, waving them good-bye. End of chapter 30. End of The Hunted Woman by James Oliver Curwood.